Everybody, I'd like to begin our Palo City Council meeting of Monday, May 4th. It's 5:05 p.m. Sorry for a few minutes late. Technical difficulties. Quick note that for anyone in the public who's hoping to join our meeting, the last page on the agenda has instructions on how to join via Zoom, on the computer, or via phone, and there are instructions on providing public comment if you wish to do so. And would the clerk please take the roll?
Councilmember Cormack?
Here.
Vice Mayor Du Bois?
Here.
Councilmember Filseth?
Here.
Mayor Fine?
Here.
Councilmember Niss? Councilmember Koo?
Here.
Councilmember Tanaka?
Here.
7 present.
Thank you very much. Our first item is a closed session item, conference with labor negotiators, including Utilities Management Professional Association, Service Employees International Union, Local 521, SEIU Local 521 Hourly, Palo Alto Police Officers Association, the Fire Chiefs Association, International Association of Firefighters 1319, and the Palo Alto Police Managers Association. Do we have any commenters on this closed session item?
If any of the attendees would like to speak to this item, please raise your hand. No raised hands, Mayor.
Okay, I'll make a motion that we go into closed session.
I'll second.
Thank you, Councilmember Cormack. If there's no discussion, let's just go through the names, and please tell me how you vote. Councilmember Cormack?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Du Bois?
Yes.
I vote yes. Councilmember Filseth?
Yes.
Councilmember Niss? Couldn't hear you, Liz. Councilmember Niss, can you?
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Koo?
Yes.
And Councilmember Tanaka?
Yes.
Okay, thank you all. That passes unanimously. So we're going to go into closed session and we'll be there for about an hour. So come back at about 6:05 or so. Any instructions from the clerk?
No instructions.
Okay, I'll see you all in the other chat. Thanks.
Thank you.
On that item, really want to apologize to staff and members of the public. Our last item went way over schedule, so my apologies for that. Our next item is a first action item, an update and discussion of the COVID-19 health emergency and the city's responses. As the clerk just mentioned, if you do want to speak on this item, please raise your hand in Zoom. If you want to speak on a later item, lower your hand and raise it then. And Mr. City Manager, does staff have a report on this one?
Yes, we'll try to keep this brief. We do, I suspect, have some items for discussion though. So I'm sorry, just as a point of order, Mr. Mayor and Clerk, has there been an announcement yet on item number 5? I wonder if you wanted to make that.
I was waiting to agenda changes, but I guess we can do it now. It's fine. So item number 5, adoption of amendments to the Palo Alto Tobacco Retail Ordinance. That item is getting moved out. I think you said till the 13th. Is that
18th, May 18th would be our next available council date. So thank you, Mayor. I thought that might be worth noting in case any member of the public is waiting for that particular item.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but perhaps if the mayor and the city manager could clarify if that would be on consent or an action item at that point, that might be helpful.
This would be an action item. We would defer it so that it would allow more time on the agenda. Thank you, Councilmember. Okay, so with that, let's see. I want to make sure we got our PowerPoint ready to go on this item. Okay. Not sure if the clerk's office can help us with the status of the PowerPoint for item number 1. I'm sorry, 2.
We are working on it.
Thank you. And actually, perhaps Mr. Duker could lead off since he was going to give our weekly update on the world from the Emergency Services Office.
Great. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Good evening, Honorable Mayor and Honorable City Council members. Chief Duker here from the Office of Emergency Services. You'll be happy to know I don't need slides, and this will be brief. As Mr. Shikata said, this is our check-in time, basically to get everybody in sync on where we are in our public safety status and response to the current pandemic. Most of you are tracking, of course, the developments that are occurring at the county level. I just wanted to make the community aware that we've got a fair bit of activity that staff and our colleagues in Cal OES, so the State Office of Emergency Services, are also tracking. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but there may be some tentative good news about the viability of antibodies possibly conferring immunity. Now, that is not at all ready for prime time, but it's one example of several of kind of potentially game-changing scientific breakthroughs or discoveries, more accurately, that could change our response. However, unfortunately, my job is to also look at the alternative cases where no immunity is conferred and other bad things occur. So with that in mind, and I will just give you all a little bit of flavor from what we discussed with the county EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, earlier this afternoon. Obviously, there's been a big push at the state level, as well as in the 6 county Bay Areas, to loosen certain restrictions in the health order that I know other staff, including Mr. Shikata, will review, so I won't bother with that because they're in the slides when he gets to that. And then B, look at the state of what the respective jurisdictions might or might not be able to do to facilitate increased testing, in particular for the virus. The antibody testing, as I alluded to, might occur a little bit later. So right now, our planning assumptions are several more weeks of some form of emergency operations, as Mr. Shikata may discuss in his slides. And the County Board of Supervisors tomorrow night will be reviewing this. It's on their agenda. Probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks, you can anticipate a bit of a nomenclature change, but it's also a change, if you will, in posture as we move from Emergency Operations Center to Recovery Operations. And that is a 3-pronged element. It is the general community recovery, the private sector in particular, and then for us as an employer, how do we reconstitute and reestablish our services? What adaptations do we make to our city workplace? So in the interest of time, I'll conclude there and be available for questions. Back to you, Mr. Shikata.
Great, thank you, Chief. Let's proceed 2 slides forward, please. Great. We did want to give the council an opportunity to hear some good news in the midst of our public safety emergency, that in spite of our ongoing response efforts, and perhaps as a result of our ongoing response efforts, we have had some positive developments locally. First is to note the work of our staff at our regional water quality control plant. There are a couple of areas that were simply too good to pass up. One is to note that our staff, in working with Stanford University, has been doing some testing, some experimental testing for the COVID-19 RNA in wastewater. And this is an interesting, novel approach that can obviously not provide diagnostic information at the individual level, but could lead to some diagnostic at the community level. So as we are examining how widespread the virus is in our service area as a model for how other metropolitan areas might evaluate presence, that this has been one of our ongoing activities from our staff at the plant, as we refer to it. Another is the work that they've been doing to take excess supply of ethanol and work with a third party in actually having it converted to hand sanitizers. So innovation continues, as is the Palo Alto tradition. We'd also note that we've got a few initiatives or projects that are underway. One is the temporary shared streets. As has been discussed at the council previously, our transportation office is working on rolling that out, no pun intended, this coming week in order to provide some focused areas along our bike boulevards that would provide some extra emphasis for the nature of walkability on a number of corridors around town. Next, that our Highway 101 bike pit underpass was opened recently in recognition of the construction that had been halted, and we know that it's being used well. So appreciate the ability to open that up in response to community requests. And finally, and a topic I suspect that the council may want to speak to a little more when we get to discussion, that testing expansion has proceeded, both with Stanford Healthcare as well as our Palo Alto Medical Foundation, PAMP, and also that the mayor and Councilmember Nis have been particularly taking a leadership role in communicating with the county on our interest in expanding both testing, contact tracing, and the full workflow that the county health officers have identified as critical to getting our communities back to work. Next slide, please. So with that, I just want to briefly reiterate the new county health order that we are now in implementation mode as of today through the end of May. Same focus is still number one priority is for people to stay at home, shelter in place, but nonetheless has loosened some areas of activity. It still and strengthens the focus on the wearing of face coverings when in public and certainly when involved in essential activities. And finally, that the areas of activity that have been opened up include construction, real estate transactions, and outdoor businesses and activities. And that we will be opening some of our own facilities with strict social distancing requirements. Now, to drill down on that in a little more detail, next slide, please. Specifically, we are on the case of private construction that we have inspectors that are now being available by appointment to work with private construction companies, private applicants in their own projects. We are restarting our own city infrastructure projects, including the CalAV garage and the Highway 101 bike bridge, not the underpass, but the bridge to replace the underpass will be resuming activity this week. Our open space preserves are opening this week during the weekdays. We're still working through what the weekend plan will be, but the weekdays you'll see midweek this week, I believe, reopening of parking availability. Also opening this week are tennis courts, pickleball courts, and other local activity venues, while recognizing that there are restrictions as to who can participate in those activities. And we are also in conversation with our golf course operator to look at their ability to reopen again with modified availability for singles. And finally, a note in an area that we know is of great interest based on the calls that we've been receiving, gardening and landscaping services are now allowed to proceed. Next slide, please. Then finally, just wanted to close with noting that we have ongoing activities in support of our business community. We have have completed now 3 facilitated roundtable discussions that council members Cormack and Nis have participated in and perhaps may want to comment on, involving 54 business leaders over the course of those 3 facilitated roundtable discussions, and that we'll be doing a follow-up discussion to ensure that we heard what they said in those 3 sessions and are identifying specific follow-up actions that we'll be able to report on in upcoming meetings. So that essentially completes my report. I know we have a specific discussion later on the agenda tonight related to the financial support for small businesses. And so, Mayor, at your pleasure, I'll stop there. And if you'd like, either open it up for our ad hoc committee members or however you'd like to proceed.
Thank you, Chief Duker, Mr. Shikata. I think just a couple quick comments here. One, let's really try to keep this focused on the public health side of things, considering we have many other budget and economic discussions later tonight. And two, against that grain, I was really hoping to hear quickly from Council members Nis and Cormac on their experience on the business roundtable. If you guys want to just share your thoughts quickly.
Are you ready for that?
Yes.
Okay, let me start on the roundtable, and I know Councilmember Cormac is going to jump in as soon as I jump off. As was just mentioned, this was 3 times that were met. It was well facilitated, and here are some of the things that I think came from this. But I begin by saying it's really hard to listen to what's happening in our community. It is there's some heartbreak out there, and it's pretty clear that everything is not going to reopen. And I think that's one of the most difficult things to be hearing. That what we have heard is that there are a number of difficulties with the city, things that the city can actually make move along more smoothly. They particularly involve the planning, the development department, and so forth. And also, again, a lot of discussion about parking, about RPP, about those who are here for different periods of time and how they will actually park. And I think one of the things we heard earlier is maybe the RPP suspension will continue for some period of time, which I think would be advisable. A couple of other things, they did talk about the trouble that they're having getting any money from the federal programs, and I think you have all heard of that. Trouble interpreting some of the instructions that have come from the county. I think we'll talk about one later tonight, which is the mask. When do you wear the mask? I did hear that Cupertino has now asked that people wear a mask whenever they leave the house, if I understand the vote they took this morning. They are also looking for guidance. They're looking for, I think, support. I think they're also looking for some hope at this point. Really, it was very difficult to hear this. So we're going to hear more of a report on Thursday morning when we all get together to talk about this again, and then decide what we can do next. And we will be talking later about what we can actually do financially next. That will be part of what we bring up later tonight. So I think then we're going to want to talk about next steps and so forth that will come in the future. I'm saying this somewhat hesitantly, but we have talked for a number of years about having somebody who worked closely with businesses, encouraged businesses, let us know what was happening. It's been some time since we've had somebody that we felt was in that position. Michelle Flaherty did that for some period of time, but she has left. I hope that in this budget, which we've just been discussing and the difficulties with it, but that we will have somebody who is willing to work closely with business and also, I hope, tell them we really do care that businesses will survive in this community and thrive as well. And I don't think that's a message they've always heard, and it's one they're looking for. So thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate that opportunity to say something about the roundtable. And again, we will be meeting again Thursday morning to discuss it.
Thank you, Councilmember Nis. Councilmember Cormac.
Thank you, Mayor Fine, and thank you, Councilmember Nis. 5 different things I want to talk about in categories. I'm going to drill down a little bit since Councilmember Nis stayed at the high level. The first is I thought people might be interested in hearing about some of the pivots and short-term things that businesses are doing. Obviously, we know restaurants are selling grocery boxes. They're also making food for frontline workers and giving it away to food banks and sometimes seniors. Some landlords have been very responsive and sympathetic, but others have been unable or unwilling to do so. Hotels have been offering daily rates to people who need a quiet place to work. I hadn't thought about that. I'm like, that's tempting. Or accommodations for healthcare workers. Many of the businesses are very heavily focused on their employees. And one of the other pivots, which I'm sure is familiar to all of us at the Palo Weekly, is really shifted to subscription model as opposed to paid advertising. And there are some medium-term changes that the businesses discussed. I think the hardest one for me to hear about was the personal services. Physical therapists, mental health professionals, hairdressers, nail salons, massage, like the changes that are going to have to occur for those to restart are really significant, and they're not able to really function during shelter in place. Hotels are going to be changing what's in the room. What are the food options? Buffets are over, apparently. There are dentists talking about spacing and sanitation and the process that people would come in. And of course, outdoor seating for restaurants. Those are all medium-term changes that we can anticipate. And then there are some permanent changes. Some businesses discuss the fact that they have proven that remote work works for some work and some tasks and some jobs. And one business said that they will have fewer employees return to Palo Alto when this is over because of what they have learned during this process. I do want to touch on restaurants because everyone talks about that so much, and it's such a big part of our community. And we've certainly heard multiple places that not all restaurants will reopen, and that I think is definitely that was borne out by the discussions. We didn't talk about this specifically in these contexts, but clearly there were restaurants that are more what I would call expense account places. Those are unlikely to be supported by the people who live here during shelter in place. There are restaurants that depend upon Stanford or office workers, and during the shelter in place time, that's difficult. And then there are some restaurants that are more supported by the people who live here. So the restaurants obviously have a whole different set of issues. And then finally, one thing that I probably had not appreciated enough was thinking about what it will be like when businesses reopen and the supply chain issues that they have now and then. Some of them will have to restart with their vendors, and they may have debts to pay off. They talked about the need to get additional personal protective equipment and sanitation supplies. And then finally, many of them will have to reconfigure their space and or refurbish equipment and furniture in order to be able to function as we come back out of this and in the future. So I just wanted to give a little bit more details in terms of that. The facilitator has been super helpful and excellent. And I believe, by Thursday, we'll have a nice set of things that we can do as a city in the short term, medium, long term to match up with these concerns. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you both. Thank you both for serving on that short-lived ad hoc, but really appreciate your work. I want to go see if there are any members of the public who wish to speak on this item. If there are, please raise your hand and the clerk will call on you. And then after that, we can come back to council. Do we see any speakers?
Mayor Fine, I see no hands raised.
Okay. Let's just give it a minute. But let's go to council. I have council member Phil Seth, then Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Thank you. Yeah, just quickly. If open spaces are going to reopen to vehicular traffic, does that include restrooms and drinking fountains?
Good question. I don't have that information. Don't know if Kristen O'Kane is available to respond to that. If so, please chime in. Thanks, Kristen.
Welcome. Good evening, Kristen O'Kane with Community Services. So we just talked about that today. We think that we will likely open restrooms in open space areas only because people are using outdoor areas as their restroom, and it's becoming a problem. We will likely keep drinking fountains closed, but the restrooms will open just like they're open in parks right now.
So not the bottle refill station at Foothills Park.
Likely not.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Sorry, I was having tech problems. Thanks for the roundtable updates. I want to say I've been hearing from many businesses directly as well. And it seems like certain banks were much better at getting loans than others. It seemed like the larger banks were kind of slow moving, and that businesses that banked with some of our local banks did better at getting loans. And then it sounded like, I think Councilmember Niss touched on this, people have been raising issues about public trust and not making business owners be the ones to enforce wearing masks inside of stores. And is that a place where the city could help? And I think, requiring masks in a place of business, it's a good idea. It helps protect these employees who are potentially seeing lots of people come in and out. And I did hear Cupertino has done that. So I would like to see us agendize that and talk about it very soon. It seemed like an easy step and something that a lot of business owners are asking for. And then I also heard them wanting to undo a lot of other council actions. So I think we need to take reasonable steps. We need to help our businesses for sure, but we need to make sure they're really emergency items and not changes that are driven like politically or that could be kind of rationalized by the emergency, but not really required by it. I heard issues all over the map. And then the last question is really, I guess, a question for city manager is, what is the status on golf courses? I've heard multiple courses in the county are opening up with restricted conditions.
Sure, I think I'll have to rely on Kristen again for the most recent feedback from our golf course operator.
Sure. So we're looking into that. The golf course would need to be very limited in the activities. So it's one person could play at a time. They'd have to pull their own hand cart, and it might not be actually worth it to open the golf course with that limited type of play. It would even be limited in that members of the same household would not be able to play together. So we're still working with them on that, but as of right now, we're not quite sure it would be financially able to do that.
Is that all, Tom?
Yeah, like I said, I've heard of some other courses that are opening. They seem to be figuring out ways to allow it to happen. And if there's a way to do it with spacing, I think it'd be good to get it open. But that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Tanaka.
Yeah, so just also wanted to thank the members of the ad hoc committee for hosting the roundtable. I think it's really important to hear how the businesses are struggling right now. I continue to hear businesses that are shutting down for good and probably never really open again. I think some businesses in the town and country are still having to pay rent, even though some of them have no revenue to pay rent. So I definitely think later on in the evening, that item is going to be really important to move along. But to this item here, I think you talked about one of the slides about looking at doing, I forgot the term you used, it wasn't closed streets, it was shared streets. And can you talk a little bit about what streets in particular are up for this?
Sure. I see Philip Cami is on the call at the meeting. So Philip, why don't you go ahead and share what we can at the moment?
Hi, happy to. Thank you for the question. So we're currently looking at doing 3 smaller pilots on Bryant, Park, and Ross.
I think it's really important to get community buy-in, of course, especially for Ross, but I think you probably know that already. Okay, so I think in general, because we sheltered in place early, we've done pretty good in not having a big spread of the disease or a lot of deaths in our community, which is fortunate. We're not like New York. And if I look at, we unfortunately are, having to do another month of shelter in place, at least, maybe longer, but at least another month. And if you look at other places, other cities that have started to open up their economy, they've been able to do so safely by, having face masks, by doing extensive random testing, and by doing contact tracing. And I realize some of this is kind of overlapping a bit with the county, but I got inspired with what Councilmember Niss said in terms of Cupertino is trying to do face mask. And so if you look at, so I have employees in Shenzhen where, China was one of the first, so Shenzhen's like the Silicon Valley of China, and they were one of the first people to get hit. But if you look at them now, they're about 90% open, right? Not 100%, but 90%. And they've been able to do that without having a resurgence, mainly because of, having face masks. Pretty much everyone wears face masks when you go outside. They do a lot of extensive random testing. And I realize we're somewhat limited right now. And they do, for anyone that's been infected, they actually do contact tracing, extensive contact tracing. And so I also support with what the Vice Mayor said in terms of maybe having this coming back to us in terms of face mask, to look at, should this be something that is strongly encouraged, if not mandated, when you go outside, at least for the time being when we're having this COVID-19 situation. And I think what's also really important is much more extensive random testing. I know we have 2 facilities now. I know that the county is supporting a lot of this, but I know that some cities like Fremont and Hayward have started doing testing. So like their fire and medics will start doing random free testing. And I think that's important because that starts to let us know what to spread, and also it would allow us to reopen safely. And that's what other places have done. If you look at Seoul, Korea, or China, or other places, they've been able to open successfully and without a resurgence because of this kind of practice. And I just want to compliment what the city manager put forward in terms of the pilot, in terms of the contact tracing. It's very, very labor intensive. We have a lot of idle employees. It's a great way to kind of prevent the continual spread. So I just want to thank you for moving that forward. And I think it's really the right thing to do, and it would allow us to maybe not return to 100% business as usual, but to get us closer. So I think these are all really good steps. And so I'd like to see more of this actually. I know right now some of this is just on the conceptual stage, but to actually see it happen in practice, I think would be awesome.
Thank you very much, Councilmember. Next is Councilmember Niss.
I'll be glad when we're in the chamber, to be quite honest. So let me pick up where Greg just left off. And I want to tell you our interaction with the county regarding testing over the last couple of weeks. I'm part of the Cities Association, as you know, and it occurred to us as a body that we were not getting the kind of feedback that we needed from the county, nor could we identify who was actually in charge of testing at the county. And it turns out, surprisingly, there wasn't anybody in charge of testing. And tomorrow at the Board of Supervisors meeting, which starts at 1 o'clock, and if any of you want to know how to get on, you can call Joe Samitian's office and find the location. But they will announce apparently tomorrow either as they said, the czar or the czarina, whomever that might be, who will oversee testing. There is not adequate testing in our county. If any of you have followed the the governor's daily debriefings at noon, I hope you've done that. He has constantly emphasized the need for testing. Today, he said, while the testing is up, it's gone up, closing in, I think, on 60,000 tests a day. He's after 80,000. And I want to emphasize the testing because as our businesses start to reopen in our community, I think most people, just as wearing a mask is important, will want to know that you have tested negative. In other cities, there's a relatively easy way to do this, which is their drive-through testing. I know that Stanford has opened up. However, 3 of us tried to get a test done and had very little luck with that. PAMP is going to open, as I understand, either today or tomorrow, but that's not a free test and it's not easy access. So one of the things that I would like to bring up next week, and this is after listening to what the county says tomorrow, is what can our part be in doing more testing at this end of the county? The county is putting very little into testing in our area. Secondly, I'd like to look at the contact tracing. The county maintains that at this point they will have a curriculum that we can access, and perhaps some of our employees will be interested in doing contact tracing. And the last one is to bring up masks again. I don't think there's any question that a mask should be used when you're going into a retail or picking up coffee someplace, whatever that might be. But I think we probably need to put some more grit behind that requirement. So next week, I'm going to ask that we bring this forward again and have a discussion, especially as we start reopening, as to how we can support our businesses and others by doing more testing here in Palo Alto and also at this end of the county. We wrote a letter, which I'd be, just as Eric sent out his spreadsheet, I'd be glad to send out the letter to everyone if you haven't received it, that went from the mayors and me in the county. So with that, unless I have forgotten to add something to that, that's my testing request for tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, I see Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Mayor Fine. I'll just pick up where Councilmember Niss left off on testing. I think if we do that, I would be less focused on the businesses and more focused on our senior facilities to begin with. Still focused on the health side and moving to economics second. So I'll just toss that in there. My one question is if we could just go back to Mr. Kami about the temporary shared streets initiative, asking for a friend on a bike boulevard. What exactly is that going to look like? And if it's happening this week, how do we share that information with people so they know how to behave?
Sure. Well, I'll just say that Megan, who actually is just messaging me, is working on the messaging. So Megan, the Chief Communications Officer, is working on the messaging for that second part of your question. For the first part of the question, what we're going to have, the pilot that we're designing on those 3 streets, what it will look like is it's going to be 3 streets that are not closed. We're not planning any closures. We're just planning to discourage non-local traffic. And so we'll have some signage that currently we're working with Public Works on that will have that at the entrances to some of the streets, signage encouraging local traffic only. We don't want anybody to admonish drivers that go on those streets that might not be local or anything like that. And we also don't want people getting upset if they see a vehicle. We want people to be mindful, pedestrians and bikes, that if they're walking along and they feel the need to keep their physical distance from somebody, that they have enough room to do so, they can enter into the street. They still should look both ways and expect that there might be a motor vehicle there as well. We're hoping that that it will end up lowering the volume and the speeds on those streets, and that they won't be used for cut through.
Okay, so signage essentially is what it is.
Yeah, it'll be very limited signage and not necessarily on every street or every entrance, and it won't be fully blocking or closing completely any entrances.
And just while I have you, is that because we think there's been a bigger problem on those streets than elsewhere, or why did we choose those streets with no kids biking to schools anymore?
Yeah, so it's not intended to obviously get kids to ride to school. It's intended to allow space for physical distancing. The reason we chose them is they're already selected as part of our bike network. They're longer strips that we could reasonably do it on. For this pilot in particular, it's good to have streets that are already low volume, that are already low speeds, because it's a lot easier to further that and further encourage the local traffic.
Okay, so
I want to clarify also, local traffic, we mean we're not going to be preventing deliveries on the street or emergency vehicles or people that live on the streets or people are visiting or
gardeners.
Anybody else that has
Especially
business on the street. And frankly, there won't be anybody issuing citations or anything like that. It's really just trying to discourage non-local traffic to the extent.
Okay, so it sounds pretty gentle, and I will rely on the fact that tens and tens and tens of thousands of people in Palo Alto now get the daily email. And based on reports, most of them are reading it pretty carefully. Thank you so much.
And if I could, just one last thing, we're going to be seeking feedback on this. So that's why we're doing a pilot with streets. We really want to seek feedback. So we want to hear from everyone how it's going.
I'm confident you'll get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, I see Councilmember Koo.
Yes, thank you. There's a constant question. So most of the questions that come to council through the council email has been asked, but there's one that is about dentists. I don't know if you know the answer tonight, but if we can get the response to that and respond to the emails, that would be super.
I would be happy to venture a statement unless either Megan or Ken are better informed and would caution me against making a statement. I'll give them a moment.
So currently the county guidance, and I have not checked the FAQ today, they just rewrote it today on a number of topics. So Megan Horgan-Taylor may need to chime in, but my understanding is that they are still discouraging general cleaning right now, but anything that is articulated as a potential health threat would be permissible for dental work. But maybe Megan has more on that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Megan Horgan Taylor. I know as much as Ken. So my understanding is that, yes, if it's a serious type of surgery or something like that, that may be able to be continued with safety protocols in place. But normal cleaning and other types of just normal dentist visits are discouraged at this time.
And I guess that's perhaps something that we can find out on tomorrow's call.
Sure. Yep.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Then going to the masks, I agree with everybody who has advocated for masks and to perhaps look into making this something that is at the city level to have it made mandatory to wear masks, just so that we can come out of shelter in place in a safe manner and not to spread it any more further. The other thing is, I was just wondering if, and please, City Manager and Chief Duker, about the testing that we learned today at the Citizen Core Council. Is that mentionable in terms of how logistics at county OES, how it's ordered by the hospitals and so forth? Can you provide that information?
Sure, let me ask Chief Duker to chime in on that.
Sure. And by the way, I did just happen to look at the Santa Clara County Public Health webpage, and that Megan is correct. So the non-urgent dental procedures are still strongly discouraged right now, any non-urgent elective procedures. So Councilmember Koo, to address your question, could I just clarify, are you asking about the what we discussed on the Citizen Core Council as far as the limitation of some of the logistics and supplies for testing? Is that correct? Is that your question?
Yes.
Great. So I'll just share, and this is in the public record too, that currently one of several limiting factors on widespread testing is that the supplies of components of test kits as well as PPE, personal protective equipment, is still unfortunately uneven. And so therefore, there have been cases, including here in the North County, where the ideal number of tests is throttled or limited by a lack of components of test kits, including the swabs, the so-called nasal pharyngeal swabs that go towards the back of the upper sinus cavity. And so those are in particular short supply. There are a number of other, on the test side, reagents and chemical components that have been a bit hit and miss in the supply chain. And then even the medium to safely transport the samples has also been in somewhat short supply. Part of that too, from the state OES, Cal OES, is they are, I forget the exact number, it's about 82 test sites that are meant to serve rural and less dense areas to facilitate testing out there. So a number of the state level supplies that have come in from various sources have been not directed to Santa Clara County. They've gone elsewhere. We don't really have visibility beyond that. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Yes, thank you. And you know, I'm also allowed to go get tested, but and there is questions that you have to answer, and it recommends that if you don't have any of those symptoms, then you don't. Then they suggest that you don't go get tested, and you know, I can respect that the test might be needed for somebody who might actually have
Correct.
symptoms or is an essential worker.
Correct. And that's a function of the scarcity of material. Many people may be familiar that Los Angeles, I believe yesterday or the day before, opened up a asymptomatic or no symptom required test site. So that might explain where some of the testing equipment and material went. That said, they have a much larger number of cases and fatalities, even pro rata. So those are decisions made above our level, but I think it is a very good thing for the community to be aware of as we talk about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And lastly, I was just very excited to learn today also that Palo Alto Medical Foundation reports that they're working with Manzanita Works, which is coordinating childcare for essential workers. And Manzanita Works reports that Manzanita Works, they're reporting that they're coordinating childcare co-ops with healthcare providers. And I think they're working with 5 different healthcare providers, a school district, as well as a grocery franchise. So I think this is a very good beginning for this co-op, childcare co-op. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Niss, I see your hand up.
So at the suggestion of our city manager, I am going to suggest bringing back for action next week the 3 items that we've just discussed. The first will have to do with face coverings and requiring them in what situation. The second will be providing tests in the North County as appropriate. And the last would be to discuss with the county their new curriculum that they have on contact tracing, and for which they're going to be looking for volunteers. So that is a motion, and I'll wait for a second and speak to it for a motion.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Okay, so Councilmember Niss has a motion, and if you could maybe just send it to the clerk for records, seconded by Councilmember Tanaka. Councilmember Niss?
Do you want me to send it before we discuss it?
Well, sorry, let's discuss it, but just please be sure to send it to the clerk for records.
Okay. So essentially, this covers 3 things that we've been discussing extensively. I don't think there's any question that face coverings make a difference. And I think, if nothing else, they certainly make everyone around you feel better if you have one on and you're walking into a retail place or into some public place, which we're probably going to start doing this very month. Secondly, the contact tracing is, as you've heard, really important, especially if someone is going back to work and you would hope that let's say they got tested and they were actually positive, you would want to contact all of their contacts that you could possibly reach. And there's a system for doing that, and the county is calling it a curriculum. And the last is the one that you've heard me discuss many, many times, which is providing more testing in the North County, and particularly in Palo Alto. Thank you.
So yeah, I've already spoken on this item, but I think all of them make sense. It allow us to open up quicker, I think, and open up safely, and that's what's important. We've all been hearing about the economic devastation it's been causing, and so I think we're following the lead of what a lot of other countries around the world have started to do successfully, and I think it's good for us to start moving this direction. So appreciate everyone's support on this.
Thank you. Okay, so the clerk has put this up on the board, and council members Nis and Tanaka, this looks about what you're looking at.
Yes.
Okay, so to discuss face coverings, I'm assuming you mean a requirement, testing in Santa Clara County, particularly the North County, and then contact tracing. Okay.
I think specifically Palo Alto, right? So I mean, yeah. I think the county's going to do their thing.
Thank you. It really should. So am I live?
Yes.
So under testing, it should say in the north part of in North Santa Clara County, and particularly Palo Alto.
Thank you for the clarification. I see hands from Vice Mayor Du Bois and Councilmember Cormack.
Yeah, so thanks for getting the motion up. I'll support this motion. Obviously, we're going to have a big budget discussion tonight. And so, Liz, you're not really suggesting any expense at this point. You just want this to come back for discussion?
Well, we'll be discussing expenses if this actually does pass, because I also know, which wasn't mentioned, that the county sent a number of tests to Stanford this weekend. And so apparently the county does have some tests that they can spare. And I think if we were able to make this available more easily, especially for people who can't afford it, that we would be able to find what we need, to be honest.
But this is the start of the discussion, and then we'll have an additional discussion in terms of incurring expenses.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Cormack.
Okay, so require face coverings. Do you mean go beyond what the county order currently is? Or do you mean the enforcement mechanism?
I mean the enforcement mechanism. It will be hard for us to go beyond what the county has said. But here is what I've heard our county health officer say. Face coverings are required unless you are exercising. And that is what I believe I have heard from her. But I've also heard she doesn't like to push the issue. And I think we actually need to enforce it, not with our police department, but enforce it more, I would call it politically. Because what I've noticed now is that people don't hesitate to tell somebody else that they ought to have a face mask on. But I think we're far more comfortable when we have face masks on, so that if we can require this as a city, which is pretty much what the county is doing, people will be more comfortable.
So I'll just wait then until we have the discussion and there's more details, because I don't see exactly what we would do. The county is requiring you to have a face covering on in a business.
Yes.
And that is enforced by them and by us, right? The sheriffs and the police department. So
I don't know if they enforce it, council member, but I think perhaps that's what I'm saying. I think it gets enforced more culturally than actually by our police or similar enforcing it.
okay, so I will be willing to support this and interested in the details when it returns.
Yeah. And I've heard, by the way, the word that the county officer uses is encouraged.
Strongly.
Strongly, yes.
Okay, so then in terms of testing, it certainly would be great to have more testing available. I will repeat my earlier comment is we need to know what we're testing for, whether it's the presence of the infection or presence of antibodies, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a very big difference between the blood tests and the nasal swab. So again, lots of details to discuss. And as far as contact tracing goes, I think we're in the very, beginning stages of figuring out who are the right people to be conducting that. And then the real issue is what happens once we've found them, right? Once you've traced the contacts, then what happens? So I'm happy to support this for more discussion. I'm not sure that next Monday is the right time to do it, honestly. I wonder if we could defer, but I'll leave that up to the mayor and the city manager.
I think with that, with all due respect, I think we're behind already. And I do know that the county will put out their curriculum tomorrow for those who wish to become contact tracers. And I hope that we as a city can be involved with that, especially since we have some employees who are not working to the fullest extent their job requires.
I'm interested in learning more. I remain concerned about some portions of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cormack. I don't see any other hands, so I'll speak quickly. And after myself, Councilmember Koo. So I'm generally supportive of this. I agree with Councilmember Cormack. There needs to be a little more pencil sharpening here. And so my proposal, it's not an amendment, but maybe Councilmembers Nis and Tanaka, if you could actually maybe do some legwork on this in partnership with staff. So on the face coverings, figure out exactly what the county guidelines are and what you think we could go further on. On the testing protocols, as you all know, myself and the city manager have been working with the county. The big questions there is we want to do testing that would be additive to the county's process and not duplicative or counter to what they're doing. And that means we really need some definition on things such as Councilmember Cormack mentioned, which type of test, how do we report results, what do we do if there's a positive result, how do we maintain medical privacy? And those are things we really need the county support on. We actually, the city, are not quite professional in those areas. And on contact tracing, again, what does that mean? Are you proposing to use city staff for contact tracing? Is it to promote it among the community? So I guess my ask of you too is I'll support this, but if you could do some legwork, even if it's, a couple paragraphs or some graphs or a couple slides of what you're thinking about, I think that'll help frame the discussion for next time.
I think we'll be happy to.
Thank you both. Those are my comments. Councilmember Koo.
I'm sorry, I didn't know how to raise my hand in this configuration. So thank you for seeing me. In regards to the face coverings, my understanding is that the transmission has been mostly community transmit. So with the face mask on, I really feel strongly that, this will kind of reduce the transmission from the person to someone else. With the rest, if it's possible to get the testing kits, if there's enough, and contact tracing, that goes hand in hand. So I think it complements each other. So thank you for the motion.
Councilmember Filseth, any comments here? Okay. Mr. Shikata, any thoughts on this?
No, I think you've had a robust discussion. As the council knows, we are very engaged in all these topics, and so happy to support the council's discussion coming up.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, with that, let's please wrap up this item and vote remotely. Councilmember Cormack.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Du Bois.
I vote yes.
Councilmember Filseth.
Yes.
Myself is yes. Councilmember Nis.
Yes.
Councilmember Koo.
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Yes.
Great, thank you all. That passes unanimously. Thank you to our city staff for bringing this item forward. One quick note to the public, these general updates and discussion of the COVID-19 health crisis and the city's response, which we've had on our agenda for the past, 6 weeks now. In the future, we're going to be breaking them up into smaller sections, maybe specifically focused on the emergency response or on, business support or economics, just to make sure that we are agendizing and noticing everyone in the public properly. Okay, our next item is agenda changes, additions, and deletions. Item 3 has been moved till later in the night, so it's now at the end of our meeting, scheduled for 9:30, which we probably won't make. And as we mentioned earlier, the city manager and I chose to move item 5 to May 18th, 2 weeks out, due to a lot of community input and that from my colleagues on council as well. With that, we go to oral communications, where any member of the public may speak to an item not on the agenda. For all of our attendees, if you're interested in speaking to oral communications, please hit the raise hand signal, and the clerk will call on you, and we're each will have 2 minutes. And Ms. Minor, if you could help our public speakers out.
David Cole, it's your turn to speak. You have 2 minutes.
Hello, Mayor and City Council. First off, I'd like to thank you for all your great work during these trying times. I was concerned to read last week that perhaps the city priorities are out the window. While we have a lot on your plate right now, there's also great opportunity. The preliminary response from the SCAP public input is that the community does not want to delay action on climate change despite the coronavirus pandemic. That the SCAP needs to be more aggressive in reaching our goals, and measurable targets are reporting. The electrification of buildings should move forward. The community does not support the use of offsets for natural gas, and that the shelter in place has shown that working from home is possible and should be continued as one of our best ways to reduce greenhouse gases from our transportation sector. You can check these initial findings with staff. Did some quick back of the envelope calculations, and it shows that we can get 10% of our needed greenhouse gas reductions with people working from home just 2 days per week. As we return to, quote, normal, many companies may not want to have a full complement at the office anyway for safety. So this is a great opportunity. I think the city council should lead the way and should see if they can have 25% of the workforce that can work from home continue to do so, and invite larger employees and the Chamber of Commerce to do the same. The experiment has been done and the results are in. Traffic is less, air quality is better, less parking problems, and we're on the road to reductions of our needed, of addressing climate change, which is our next pandemic in the making. Climate change is similar to the current pandemic in that following the science and taking early aggressive actions are really key to our success. Let's not throw out our priorities now when there's a great opportunity to be realized. We can do better than getting back to just normal. I'm hoping we can act on these. Thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. David Page, it's your turn to speak.
Hi, this is David Page from Midtown. I'm the co-chair of 350.org SV Palo Alto. Our group met this morning, and we want to second what David Cole was just saying about the remote work. We're hoping that the city council will direct staff as soon as possible to have some type of formal announcement that city staff who are working remotely at the current time will be able to continue to do so for as long as possible. I wrote up something about this. I'll send you an email in the next few days, and I very much appreciate your taking my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Page. If there's any other attendees who wish to speak, would you raise your hand at this time so we can call you? Mr. Mayor, there's no other hands raised.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both our speakers. That moves us on to item number 4, minutes approval for April 13th and 20th. Are there motions on minutes?
I'll move the minutes.
Thank you. Is there a second? I'll second it. Great. Okay. So Councilmember Cormack, seconded by myself, to move the action minutes. If you'll please vote. Councilmember Cormack.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yes.
Councilmember Filseth.
Yes.
Myself is yes. Councilmember Niss.
Yes.
Councilmember Ku.
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That passes unanimously. We now move on to our consent calendar minus item number 5. So we have 6, 7, 8, and 8A.
I'll move consent.
Second.
Thank you, Vice Mayor and Councilmember Niss. Do we have any speakers on the consent calendar?
No, we do not.
Okay. My colleagues on council, any comments on the consent calendar? No? Okay, let's vote. Councilmember Cormack.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yes.
Councilmember Filseth.
Yes.
Myself is yes. Councilmember Niss.
Yes.
Councilmember Ku.
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So that means our consent calendar absent item number 5 passes unanimously. We now move to city manager comments.
No further comments, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Thank you. So then we move on to our action calendar. We have 3 items in a study session tonight. A lot of work to get done. Let's get right into it. Maybe we can do this first one and then take a 5-minute break or so. Our first item is item number 9, adoption of a resolution waiving the business registration fee, including late fees for calendar year 2020, and rescinding the levy of assessments for the Downtown Business Improvement District for FY 2020 and reimbursements.
Good evening, Council. This is Kylie Noze, the Administrative Services Director. Tonight we have David Ramberg, our Assistant Director, who is going to abbreviate this presentation for you on the action before you. David?
Thank you, Kylie. And I've attempted to share my screen, so let me see if I can make that work here. I'm gonna do that again, pardon me. Okay, is that coming up for folks?
We can see it.
Great. So tonight we are discussing the potential next direction for the business registry fees and the business improvement district. And let me also show my video. Sorry about that. I've been asked to keep this brief in the name of time here tonight. So what I will do is really just focus on this slide and then the final recommendation slide. Coming out of the March 23rd council meeting, due to the COVID-19 event, the city council discontinued work on the business tax measure, and along with that motion was asking staff to come back with a consideration of a waiver for the business registry fee. And so that's what we're returning with tonight. There are 3 recommendations that are included, and that's to waive the 2020 business registry fee, to rescind the 2020 bid assessments. We included that in tonight's recommendations. They are very much linked. And to reimburse for both the registry fees and the assessments that have been collected to date. And you see the amounts there for each of those. A couple of the recent events on the timeline was, as a reminder, in June 2019, the council, as they do every June period, adopts the assessments for the business improvement district. And then in early March, as we do, we began the collection of the registry and bid assessments. And then in late March, with the COVID-19 event, we extended the due dates for each until June 30th. The city manager did that. And so with tonight's recommendations, there are some costs that will be accrued and some revenues that we will not see as a result of that. What we would need to do at a later time is come back to the city council with any final adjustments to those costs, and that would be worked into the fiscal year 2020 projections and any year-end adjustments. And to keep it brief, I'm skipping over slide 3 and going straight to the recommended actions, which is to adopt a resolution waiving the business registry fee for 2020 and waiving all late fees for the 2020 collection cycle, as well as rescinding the approval of the levy of assessments for the bid for fiscal year 20 and approve the reimbursement of both the registry fees and the bid assessments that have been collected so far and paid by businesses. And with that, we are available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ramberg. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak to this item?
If there are any members of the public who would wish to speak, please raise your hand. We have Becky Sanders.
Great. Let's give 2 minutes to each speaker, please.
Becky, go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Miner, and thank you, council and staff. So I kind of get why we would want to like return fees and just kind of stop putting additional stress on businesses during the COVID. But I'm a student and I'm going to school, and we had to go to online and do a bunch of jumping around to make it happen. And they're not really rescinding my fees. So I just want to make sure that the rescission and the process is for the right reason, that it actually is a benefit. And it's not just an opportunity for people who are kind of against the registration and the associated programs to just kind of put the kibosh on a program that is actually a really good program. And I would hate to see this set a precedent. So I appreciate this and the opportunity to speak, and I'm sure you'll make the correct decision. But thank you for hearing me this evening. I'm done.
Thank you, Ms. Sanders. If there's any other members of the public who wish to speak, please raise your hand at this time. Okay. Mr. Mayor, there's no other hands.
Thank you. Okay, thank you to our speaker there. Let's return back to council. I see lights from Vice Mayor Du Bois, Councilmember Koo, Councilmember Tanaka in that order.
Yeah, so I just want to make 2 quick comments and then I'll go ahead and make a motion. So we are waiving the fees, but businesses are still required to register. And we're going to come up on item number 11. And to apply for the City Small Business Grant Program, you have to be registered as well. And so with those reminders, I will go ahead and move the staff motion.
Thank you.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Councilmember Tanaka. Do you want to speak to your motion?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to do what we can for businesses. This is obviously a small fee. I think the downtown bid fee is more significant depending on what classification you fall in. I do hope it's temporary. I think the bid has put on some nice programs downtown. But I support this. I think it's the right thing to do at this point in time.
Councilmember Tanaka?
Yeah, same thing as the Vice Mayor said. It's not a lot of money, but people are really suffering. Businesses are going under all the time right now, every day. We're basically in an economic depression. I think this could help them stay in business, even if it's just a little bit. And I think using the term that the Vice Mayor said earlier, a lot of businesses are on life support right now. So I think we need to help as much as we can.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Koo.
So I can support the bid being given the waiver, but I cannot understand why we would waive the $50 registry fee. Like you said, that's a small number, but it's also a number that will support a lot of what the businesses are asking for in order to have them reopen. Things like what they ask for, PPEs, as well as sanitizers, if we can go that direction. And then also, does the business registry, it's not just for the small and medium businesses, it's also for the larger businesses. So just going blanket, removing that fee, I don't like that. You know, it's just like not even thinking further about what we can do with the $50 from the businesses. It's a registry fee and it's a small amount. So I would hope that you would consider that and thinking it through about what the bid is doing, where we can't really do much about the marketing and having banners and events, but the registry fee is something completely different. The city still needs to make recovery as well as have some money in order to provide certain services or products for the business community. That's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Cormack.
I just wanted to take a moment to compliment the staff on a very well-written staff report. And I particularly appreciate the fact that so much thinking went into the process. So the idea that people have already paid will get their refund issued without having to do any work. So I do appreciate that. On an overall basis, I think this is a gesture, and I think it's appropriate to make that during this extraordinary time.
Thank you. Councilmember Filseth.
Yeah, thanks very much. Couple of quick questions on this. On the business registration fee, $50 seems pretty nominal. Where is the drive to do this coming from? Did it come up in the business roundtable or something like that?
Let staff respond on the date, but this was actually a referral from council at one of the previous COVID updates.
Yeah, I believe it was the March 23rd council meeting.
So it came from the council, not from businesses.
Correct.
So, okay. And then second, on the business improvement district, you know, that's funds that we collect for the bid and give them back to the bid to use on programs. So did they ask for this?
So when we reached out to the bid, they did not ask for it outright. We said that we were considering it, and they voiced support for this change for not collecting in the upcoming year.
Okay. So I guess this is a dumb question, but given that their drive for the business registration fee seems to be coming from council, not from businesses, is it going to cost us more to not collect it than to just collect it?
For the refund that our partner contractor Avenue Insights will need to do, there is no additional cost for the refunds, and that's primarily the largest additional outlay of time is mainly on the refund side, and they're not going to charge us. That's not an additional charge.
All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Councilmember. Just a couple of comments. I agree with my colleagues. This is the right thing to do. It's a small amount, but given what our businesses are suffering, I think this is appropriate. I guess the one thing, and it's not a discussion for tonight, is for us to really consider on the council and the community what is the purpose and future of the bid. You know, just at a high level, what this is all the businesses in the downtown area pay a small fee to be a participant in downtown as a business, and it depends on how many employees they pay. And then the bid uses those funds for things like events, cleaning and greening, signage, promoting downtown businesses. So it's really meant to be, you know, an investment in ourselves. And I think as Councilmember Tanaka mentioned, this recession or just depression, whatever you want to call it, I'd like to think these kind of strategies will be important. But nonetheless, this council and previous councils have had some disappointments in what's come out of the bid. So I guess there's a longer term discussion of, you know, what happens next year with this bid. Do we reorganize it? Do we wind it down? Do we extend the waiving of the fees? But don't need to focus on that right now. Councilmember Niss, do you have any comments on this? No?
Oh, I'm ready to pass it.
Okay, great. Let's please vote by voice. Councilmember Cormack,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yes.
I have my hand up.
Oh, sorry,
I'm
sorry.
sorry.
Sorry, Lydia. Councilmember Koo.
Okay, I just want to have I have a question. I'd love to support it, but I have a question. So the FY 2020, so you're waiving only until the fiscal year, which is June 30th. Is that correct?
This is waiving of the whole fiscal year 20 the whole 2020 collection cycle. So the 2020 collection cycle started in the March timeframe, and the normal due dates would have been March 31st for the BRC and April 13th for the bid. And so we extended those to June 30th while we brought this back to council. And this would waive the fees and the late fees for this entire collection period until next year, which would be next March. So March of 2021.
Actually, to clarify, that on the bid, this item resolves it only through June 30th. So it is actually time for addressing these issues for FY21. And so that item will have to be dealt with very quickly in the next few weeks.
And what Mr. Ramberg said for the registry fee, for the registry, that would go to March of next year.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And does it automatically come back, or it comes back, reinstates automatically, or is it going to have to come to council again for reinstating the programs?
Right. We are intending that this is a one-time deferral, or one-time cancellation, and that it will be renewed automatically next year.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Koo. Okay, let's vote. So Councilmember Cormack.
Still yes.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yes.
Councilmember Filseth.
Yes.
I'm a yes. Councilmember Niss. Is anyone here? Councilmember Niss.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Koo.
Yes.
And Councilmember Tanaka.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay, that passes unanimously. I'm going to propose a 5-minute break, if that's okay, and then we'll come back to item number 10. So we'll be back here at a few minutes past 9. Thank you all so much.
Streaming. Of course, you're listening live on KZSU Radio 90.1 FM, Democracy in Action, and also it is on YouTube. So a special broadcast tonight as we're putting it all together as the Palo Alto City Council has met, and of course the big issue is the economy, and of course the Downtown Business Registry, with Kylie knows, worked so hard on garnishing that up, taking polls for something that would go on the ballot. What the council did tonight was basically an act of compassion in a time when so many businesses are incredibly hurting in downtown. And Lydia Koo, a question though, what about bigger businesses? Shouldn't that be put on there? But in the end, it was more of a gesture. One council member brought up that they're not really questioning the whole idea of the registry, but for now, it's the best move for the council. So that passed. Also tonight, we were talking earlier about golf, and can I get out there and hit the golf balls? They didn't really say. There's some trepidation on the golf course actually opening. When it does open in Palo Alto, it's pretty much going to be you can get out there and you get a cart and you play by yourself, which is of course one of the great things about golf. You can go out, but it doesn't sound like they're ready for groups of golfers or foursomes or twosomes or best ball or anything like that. Certainly not at this time. So they're taking it slow. We're not Florida. Of course, if you've ever played golf in Florida, you know, the most dangerous thing about playing golf is they have gators on the course. So that's the thing you're worried about if you're out in Florida. You may not be worried about the coronavirus as much as, you know, if you reach into the wrong. There's always a hole out there that has a gator, and they'll tell you that in the pro shop. But and he has a name, you know, Beatrice or whatever. But that I think they're all playing golf out in Florida. Florida, of course, one of those states that have opened up. The governor there being very taking in a lot of criticism for a lot of things, but they have opened up, and he feels confident that his state will do well. They've survived spring break, and they've opened up the beaches there and recreation there, certainly the golf courses and businesses there. And Governor DeSantis is quite different from Governor Newsom when it comes to that. And he got heavily criticized for the spring breakers that everybody looked at, but he feels that their numbers are good enough to do that. Other areas of the country have opened up, as we talked about. Also, earlier tonight, Liz Niss was leading the way. Liz Niss, an RN, quite a nurse, quite a career in healthcare, talking about face coverings and the importance of face coverings and why it just makes everyone feel better. Also, tracing, the whole idea of how you can trace someone. If someone is sick, who have they talked to? What roles should that take? And then just more testing generally. So there's the tracing, the testing, and face masks and covering. And then one issue was, should authorities be in charge of enforcing face masks in stores, or does the stores enforce that? I'm Vince Larkin, 90.1 FM, KZSU Stanford. We're on a break at the Palo Alto City Council. It is the top of the hour. It's 9 o'clock, and we're live on this special May 4th coverage of the Palo Alto City Council on teleconferencing, Zoom, Edmund Peninsula Access, cable television, streaming, and you're listening to 90.1 KZSU Stanford, home of the Stanford Cardinal, and Democracy in Action. So that was an issue that they all looked at. Of course, you know, I can get on my bike and I can ride, and I can wear my balaclava, I wear my face mask that I wear when I'm skiing. It's getting warmer now, and so, you know, but you got your helmet, and so you're pretty covered up. But when you see joggers all the time, very few of them wear masks, and I always stay a little bit away from them because they exfoliate more. They found that if you run by a jogger, they're exfoliating more sweat and everything, about 6 feet ahead, 6 feet behind, even more than 6 feet, sometimes even more than that, they say, so you should avoid them. But of course, if you wear masks, it's very hard to run in a mask. I haven't gone running in a long time because I've ordered masks, but I don't have a mask. And I mean, there are some masks you can wear, but it's very uncomfortable, I think, to run in a mask. So you see people running, and most of them don't have masks on. And you know, you wonder, and they did mention, well, when it comes to exercising, you don't need to wear a mask. So I don't know where they are with that, but I mean, I've ordered some masks. I'd like to try it with the mask, but I don't really feel comfortable running without it, running out there without one. But then again, it's uncomfortable running with a mask on because you want to or cycling, you can cycle with a mask on. It's a little bit easier. You know, you're not, you know, or you can pull the mask down when there's nobody around. Maybe you can do that when you're running, but Gennady isn't here. He's covering it from another location, so I can't ask him when he goes out for his run, does he wear a mask or not? But that was brought up. So that's going to be an issue that's going to be faced next week. They're going to relook at that, relook at face coverings, the enforcement of face coverings. And it seems like they were moving to sort of a Palo Alto, where they're going to have a general Palo Alto thing where you have to wear a mask outside in Palo Alto all the time. And then also the tracing. Very important for Lizness is the whole testing and where that is going. Well, we have a study session tonight that's coming up. We're going to be looking at that. And tomorrow night there is a finance committee meeting as well. And they got a late start tonight with the closed session with labor negotiators that went on for quite a while. And that took place with Ed Chicata, Rumi Portillo, Molly Stump, Monique Leconge, Ciceran, Nick Raish, Kylie Nose, and Gina Rakanova with the Employees Unions Utilities Management Professionals Association, UMPAPA, UMPAPA, Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Local 521, Service Employees International, Local 521, Hourly Unit, Palo Alto Police Officers Association, known as PAPA, PAPOA, P-A-P-O-A, Palo Alto
Okay, I see four of us. I'm going to give it 1 minute or so more to let her. There we go. Okay, let's bring council back into session. It's 9:07. And now we are moving on to item number 10, review of the potential financial scenarios due to the current COVID-19 emergency and direction to staff on the continued development of the FY21 budget. Does staff have a report?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I'll ask Kylie Nose, our Chief Financial Officer, to speak for staff. I would just note to provide a little bit of context that tonight, again, we're talking about the identification of the financial scenarios, kind of the big picture, such as with evolving facts, evolving information that we see related to our current health emergency and how that factors into the fiscal year budget process that you're currently on. After tonight's discussion next week, we will come back with recommended specific actions through which to close the budget gap, such as it may be referred to, in order to get through our charter obligations to have you adopt the budget by the end of June. With that, Ms. Nose.
I was on mute, sorry.
Happens to all of us.
Start over again. All right. Good evening, Mayor and City Council. As Ed mentioned today, we're going to go through some scenarios that will continue our conversation on where we're at from a financial perspective as a result of COVID-19. Just as a kind of an overview, as a reminder to the council, we really are in unprecedented times within our city's history. We continue to not know the length or depth of this emergency and how it will essentially ripple through kind of our social lives as well as our economic, obviously, drivers. And we are doing our best to walk ourselves through it, and tonight is yet another step in that. So we started and produced the proposed budgets that the council has and the community has for fiscal year 2021. Those were released on April 20th, and those are really baseline budgets. Those are the place that we're going to start our conversation from. And today we're going to review and determine assumptions that we want to use to modify those proposed budgets. And then ultimately, once we make this choice this evening, staff will bring forward the impacts of what tonight's choice would mean in terms of how would we balance financially our resources. And that conversation will start next week on Monday, May 11th. So just a reminder of the priorities that staff continues to use as we move through this, as we work towards finding that kind of fiscal sustainability and financial balancing actions. Obviously, we use one-time money for one-time needs, ongoing money for ongoing needs. And in this specific instance, we provided the additional fiscal and budget recovery priorities to help guide our work, such as really keeping an eye on economic recovery. Obviously, as the economy recovers, so too, hopefully, will our tax revenues as those economic drivers continue to grow. We're obviously looking at new ways to do our business, looking really at citywide approaches the council discussed last time, the preference of not to go across the board and really be strategic in how we look at rebalance the financial shortfalls. And then, of course, using temporary solutions to bridge losses in the short term. Again, as another reminder, the council saw this when we discussed the budget, but this is an overview of the fiscal year 21 baseline budget revenue estimates. And as a reminder, those that are in red are really those revenues that we're seeing an immediate and frankly significant impact as a result of the shelter-in-place order from COVID-19 and the social changes that are occurring. The yellow ones are really medium-term or medium impact areas, or areas that we're not 100% certain in terms of the implication. So for example, property taxes, we've heard from the county assessor's office that we should expect to see reassessments of the roll similar to what the assessor did during the Great Recession. But if Palo Alto looks at our property tax changes during that period of time, the revenue drops were not as precipitous as they were in other areas such as sales tax and TOT. And then the green areas are by no means guaranteed, but definitely the more stable revenue categories of our general fund. So as we look at this, we're really looking at about almost 45 to 50% of our revenues are extraordinarily impacted by the COVID-19 situation. So as we move forward, council has seen and heard for over a month now that staff is estimating about a $20 million loss in fiscal year 2020. This is a combination of taxes, program revenues such as licenses and permits, charges for services for rec programs or regulatory programs, offset partially by savings that are expected. So staff has looked at vacancy savings and hopefully with the other stringent measures that we've taken, such as the hiring freeze, that will continue to help us offset this revenue impact. We will come forward at a later date to balance 2020, but obviously this will have a big impact on our budget stabilization reserve, as we've discussed previously. Tonight, we're going to go through the fiscal year 21 scenarios, which basically estimate between a $20 and $39 million loss in our major general fund tax revenues. So scenario A, which staff has frankly deemed not feasible, it was a disaster recovery. When we initially saw this, we thought, okay, you look at the unemployment claim spike, you saw kind of the economic contraction as a result, similar to something like a hurricane or a flood, but the shelter in place is extended beyond. And we know now, based on the governor's kind of return to quote unquote normal, that this will be a phased and stepped approach. So more likely we'll be seeing something between our scenario B and C, which is a shelter in place through the spring followed by an economic recession, or scenario C, which was more pessimistic, assuming a shelter in place through winter followed by an economic recession. So really the difference is how long does the shelter in place stay, and how slow or rapid do we move out of the shelter in place? So here are the numbers. This table mirrors the one in the staff report and is really looking at those two scenarios for our major taxes. And as you can see, you'll see significant changes in those taxes that were in that red slice of the pie, and you'll see more minor adjustments in those slices that are in the yellow portion of that previous pie chart. So you'll see the major drivers for the losses are losses in sales tax and TOT. In scenario B, you can see they're in the 20 to 30% range drops, and scenario C, you see they're more in the 40 to 50% drops. Overall, scenario B is looking at about $21 million loss in general fund tax revenues, and scenario C is looking at a $38.8 million loss in tax revenues. Something to bear in mind, and I know this will come up later, is the council by priority has chosen to allocate a portion of its TOT to the council approved infrastructure plan of 2014. So what that is some of this council as well as previous councils have chosen certain TOT revenues due to ballot measures that were passed in the last few years, increases in the TOT rate, as well as certain hotel taxes from new hotels to go towards funding the 2014 council infrastructure plan. That's the plan for major infrastructure projects such as the fire stations, the Cal Avenue garage, the public safety building, etc. Obviously, those same hotels are seeing a drop in TOT, just as the other hotels are seeing. And so as part of these reductions, so for example, as part of that $21.3 million loss in tax revenue, that means it's a $4.5 million loss in transfer to the capital infrastructure fund. So this is just trying to illustrate one of the many interconnectivity pieces of our budget and how different funds pay for different investments that we make in the community. So before the council tonight is really guidance to staff on how to and what type of assumptions to use as we bring forward the 2021 revised budget to be considered on May 11th. This is a continual iterative process. As Ed mentioned at the beginning, we're working with imperfect information. So arguably, probably neither of these scenarios are correct. In fact, I could probably guarantee you neither of them are correct. Even just today with the governor's new order that potentially businesses are opening in the next week changes both of these scenarios potentially. And so really we are working in an imperfect world, and what's important is that we balance this uncertainty but continue to move forward so that we can address this in a nimble fashion. And by that I mean we are talking about changes to service levels that will result as a result of these estimates. We're talking about impacts to the community, impacts to how the city does business. And so really weighing the appropriate scenario will be important, but it's important for the council to understand, even though we'll get guidance tonight, things will continue to change and staff will continue to revise and update the council. That's our best available information as we move through this process. So if there's one constant, it's that things will continue to change. So staff put before council 3 different options to potentially start the discussion about what a motion might be. The first was to build a budget based on the fiscal year 21 scenario B. So this was, again, that shelter in place through spring or early summer with an economic recessionary period following. And when I say economic recessionary period, staff used our prior experience in both the Great Recession as well as the .com timeframe to look at how our tax revenues performed in those periods to come up with the estimates. It would assume that as soon as June, businesses could start to reopen. Our economic engines like our downtown core, Cal Avenue, Stanford Shopping Center, our largest sales tax generator, would reopen. And we would continue and start to rebuild the sales tax base, frankly, before fiscal year 2021 begins. TOT would remain sluggish initially. However, it assumes things like schools go back, such as Stanford, would reopen in the fall. Not to say that they won't, but we don't know what the future holds in terms of large events, sporting events, and we've heard across the nation different thoughts on how universities will address this. Scenario C is another option. So the council could choose to go extremely conservative. And what this assumes is hotels and restrictions continue to be enforced through the winter time. So this is really looking at a really slow, phased approach through December, and then following that December timeframe, a recessionary period as well. So if you think about it, this one assumes kind of status quo, shelter in place through December, and then you have for 6 months of FY21, and then another 6 months of a recessionary period. Like I said, continued restrictions on travel, continued restrictions on non-essential businesses, and continued downward pressure on places like our downtown core and Stanford Shopping Center. Transiency occupancy tax would remain at or near current levels as we continue to restrict travel, as we continue to do remote work, and encourage people to social distance. In the absence of going to one of the extremes, another option staff wanted to provide council was direction that could fall somewhere in the middle. So something like building a budget based on scenario B, but assuming a certain level of getting to scenario C. So for example, if we said build a budget based on scenario B and then another 50% of scenario C, that would look like about a $30 million loss in major tax revenues. So that's a scenario that falls somewhere between B and C, as we try and balance this unknown. This assumes a more rapid phased lifting. So potentially based on the governor's actions today, if stores are able to open soon, non-essential stores, frankly, as long as they're following social distancing, that may help restart some of the drivers from an economic standpoint for us. But obviously the full effects and impacts of that are unclear at this time. It assumes that restrictions on travel and other social distancing areas would be lifted sooner, obviously, than the winter. But large crowds and, like concerts or sporting events wouldn't happen until much later. So on the TOT side, it would show a little bit of a steadier rise. So it wouldn't have everything depressed to current levels for the first 6 months, but would really keep it at a low level in terms of occupancy, nowhere near our 80% levels that we've seen, but definitely not as low as the 10% of where we're at, and let it steadily drift through the fiscal year. So again, all of these are options and a starting point, I think, for council's discussion tonight. Recognizing that we are, again, in an imperfect situation, and trying to make our best guesses as we plan to move forward. Just to help council understand that we will continue, council and the public, we will continue to have conversations about this. So this isn't the last time we'll talk about this. The direction that council will provide to staff will then be fed into the budget conversations on May 11th, 12th, and 13th, with a final conversation on May 26th. We will continue to do outreach over the course of that time period, and then ultimately in June bring forward an adopted budget after all of this review for council's final approval. I believe we scheduled June 22nd at this point. And these are the dates. So ultimately, as we move through, we'll do an overview on May 11th with the impacts of what a balancing strategy would look like based on the principles that we've outlined and balancing towards the direction from tonight. Then on the 12th and the 13th of May, we will specifically look at the impacts. So what would the actual specific proposals be in order to meet these new financial targets with a final review on that May 26th date. Concurrent to all of this, of course, we will continue to maintain our essential services, continue to adapt our services to the new health order that came out from the county, and continue, frankly, to work on our recovery strategy with work such as the business roundtables, which have been really, really helpful from an information perspective. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ed or the council for any questions, discussion, etc.
Thanks, Kylie. We should go, Ed, can I just ask, can you email this to the council members, this presentation?
Sure.
Thank you.
Really just ready for your questions, and as you're suggesting, Mayor, perhaps go to the public.
Yep. No, I think we should go to the public, and then we'll come back to council. So if members of the public wish to speak to this item, please hit the raise hand button, and the city clerk will help you to share your comments. I do want to remind anybody who is planning to speak, tonight we're not talking about specific budget cuts. We're really trying to figure out what are the scenarios with which we need to approach fiscal year 21's budget.
Mayor, at this time, there are no raised hands.
Okay. Well, thank everyone for listening, then we appreciate that as well. The first lights I saw were Councilmember Filseth, then Nis, then Tanaka.
Thank you. Two quick questions, actually, right to start with. First, have we actually seen sales and sales tax and TOT data for Q1 yet? And if not, when do we see that? And then when do we see that for Q2?
Thank you for the question. As for the full Q3 data for transient TOT, no. There's a 1 to 2 month lag on that one. And definitely no for sales tax. Sales tax is a quarter lag. So I can have Taryn Narayan, our Treasury Debt and Investment Manager, provide additional detail, but no, we don't. The short answer is we don't have all those pieces yet.
So we should expect to see Q3 TOT data sometime in May or something like that, and then sales tax data June, July. Okay, so it's going to be a while till we see actuals on that. Okay, and then other question was, I noticed in your major tax revenues and scenarios here, I didn't see charges for services in there, which is a fairly sizable item. Did you guys leave that out because of the assumption it would be offset by expenses?
We did, partially. Obviously, that's a council priority call. But in order to be strategic in our conversation, obviously the scenario that we choose to move forward with, or rather the assumptions behind it, staff will use that to help guide our estimates on other areas such as charges for services and licenses and permits. And staff will do their best as we look towards how we balance those programs to maintain whatever the prior cost recovery level was.
Okay, but then looking at thank you for putting the slide up, looking at this chart, should we conclude that scenario B and scenario C, we should actually consider to be more conservative than, or larger shortfalls than 21 and 39 million, because there should be some shortfall of charges for services in there as well, which isn't shown here?
Overall, do I think that those other two categories will decline and so make that $21 million increase? Yes. But I think that, those are areas like the development center where the council has a policy to keep it at 100% cost recovery levels. Right. So as we're looking at those revenue estimates, staff will bring forward the necessary adjustments to keep those programs in line.
I understand. So I understand the sense, and it makes sense, but it seems like from an apples to apples perspective, as we look at revenues and expenses, probably we should be using different numbers for larger numbers than 21 and 38.8 for scenarios B and C, since we're going to look at expenses, aggregate expenses too, for consistency.
Understood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Niss.
So, Kylie, I apologize for not, we should really be calling you Chief Financial Officer Nazay. And so let me begin that way instead. I want to talk about property taxes. So usually there's a lag, which we certainly have talked about. But my recollection from the last time we went through this was that things stayed stable relatively. That was the recession, stayed fairly stable through the first year. And then the property taxes really dove the second year, because in 2010, they did a number of reassessments. So would you guess we would see something, I'm looking at your line here, would you guess we would see something similar or not?
To be honest, I don't know. It depends on the real estate market and how this emergency and how, I guess, long lasting the economic impacts are on it, of it. If I look back at 2010 at our property taxes, in 2010, our property taxes grew about 2%. So that's just the normal COLA. And in 2011, they dropped by 1.1%. And that was the only decline. So Palo Alto is a really strong property base, and really through that recession period did show its resiliency. The reason why Palo Alto felt probably a significant impact on property taxes is when it saw that increase of 2% or decline of 1%. Prior to that period, the city was seeing 7.5%, 14%, 10% increases in property values. So even though it wasn't a negative, the city was so used to such large increases, I'm sure it felt like it from a financial planning perspective.
And also looking at sales taxes, and you mentioned Stanford Shopping Center is very significant. A question regarding their usual shopper. I think what I have frequently heard is people come from all over the world to shop there. And would we anticipate that if there's less travel, we're going to have fewer people shopping at the shopping center? And I would just have to reflect on how I might shop and people I know shop, probably not there. So I'm guessing that probably is, as we might say, a destination shopping center. Would that be correct? Do you have an idea?
It is definitely a destination area. It definitely recovers costs beyond, it reflects activities beyond just, say, the Palo Alto population, but obviously it includes visitors. So whether those visitors are international or regional from outside just the city proper of Palo Alto, I couldn't opine on that, but the activities at the mall definitely extend beyond just just Palo Alto proper.
Yeah. So I know that I have read that that's one of the most successful shopping centers in the country. And so my thought would be perhaps we can be hopeful about that particular, our income in that case. So then you also showed an alternative scenario. Can you pop that up again? So I actually thought this was a very appealing scenario. I know we're probably looking more at C because that we want to assume the worst in order to feel far more encouraged when the worst doesn't happen. But I thought this looked very encouraging. And again, you talked about Cal Ave, the Stanford Shopping Center, and so forth. And also it looks at our TOT in a more positive light. So I don't know where we're going to end up tonight, but I think it's worth some observing of how we are culturally, as well as just looking at the numbers and how those play out. So thank you, Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you, Councilmember Niss. I should have mentioned, let's go through a round or two of questions before we have motions. This is a big item. Next, I have Councilmember Tanaka.
Yeah, so Chief Financial Officer Nose, thank you so much for putting this together. It's much more detailed than before versus just 20 or 30 million, just big round numbers. So I definitely appreciate having the numbers. I realize that you don't necessarily have actuals for, for certainly this quarter and even Q3, as Councilmember Phil said, but you do have it for Q1 and Q2, and I don't know whether it's possible, to see how, at least for the first half, how did that vary? I assume it's probably pretty close, but do you know how close or far away it was, Q1 and Q2, was from the 2020 fiscal year 2020 modified budget?
Well, so actually staff adjusted the fiscal year 20 budget based on activities through December. So when staff brought forward the mid-year budget to council, we do look at how things were performing. And overall, across the board, we were expecting to remain within budget levels, but staff definitely made some tax revenue adjustments. For example, in that mid-year budget, we brought down our TOT estimates because prior to COVID-19, we were already seeing a softening of those receipts.
Okay, so actually, whoever's controlling the slides, can you flip it back to the table again? Okay, so the column, this is the fiscal year 2020 column. So this, for the first half, has already been modified to actuals?
Correct.
Okay, but the Q3 and Q4 remain the projections prior to COVID-19?
Correct.
Okay. And then, so I realize that it takes a while for you to get data in, right? You're not going to get official data, but have you tried reaching out to, various retailers? I know you guys have been having business roundtables or in hotels to kind of get assessment from them as to what level of business they're seeing right now.
Sure. At a high level, I can speak to that, and then I can ask Taryn specifically what he's done. But I do know that we have reached out to the San Mateo CVB, which our hotels are a part of, to see how they're doing. And we've also reached out to some of our individual hotels because our experience here in Palo Alto is slightly, frankly, worse than the San Mateo CVB. And so we've used that to assist us. In terms of reaching out to specific retailers or restaurants, I don't think we've necessarily called the businesses specifically. We've really been looking at the reports that have been coming out from a financial and economic standpoint of how business is reporting their retail and restaurant. And then we also have been looking, when we did these sales tax estimates, we've also been comparing them against a model our sales tax consultant provided us, where we can actually change the assumptions sector by sector to try and play with and tweak what we think might happen in, say, retail, restaurants, and or business to business. But I will ask Taryn, did I miss anything?
No, this is Taryn Narayan, Manager of Treasury Debt Investment. Sorry, my host is blocking my video, so you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. It looks like my host unblocked me, so I'll start the video. But yeah, I think Kylie sums it up very nicely. We have our internal modeling forecast in terms of sales tax. We have our vendor. They use a different model, and surprisingly, we came to a very close number. We were like less than 100,000 apart in terms of hit. So that gives us a great deal of confidence. As Kylie mentioned, we have reached out to some of the hotels, the Vistas Bureau, the Silicon, Santa Clara Valley. About 11 of our hotels are completely closed. They represent about 30% of the rooms within the city. The rest of them were at either 5% occupancy, or we're heading toward 5% occupancy. So 5 to 10%.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm really glad you guys are doing this kind of first-hand research, because it's going to take a while for us to get actual data, like the hard numbers. Did you talk to them about what kind of projections they would see, let's say in fiscal year 2021? And if so, what kind of numbers did they give?
We did not ask. They basically are struggling with the same thing. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of when things will be allowed to open up, obviously for them, for travelers. So we did not ask that question, but in general, it's an unknown.
Okay. I mean, the reason I ask is, in my business, I work with a lot of physical retailers, and a lot of physical retailers, as you guys know, are shut down. Like this whole Stafford shopping center is shut down. And people are trying to start opening stores, but it's hard. There's all these unclear restrictions, and frankly, even when people open, not a lot of shoppers, right? A lot of people are not necessarily, when they're losing their job or losing their house, they're not necessarily in the mood to spend a lot of money. So, in my this is not a scientific, but in my kind of informal survey of various retailers, scenario C actually comes pretty close to what they're saying. Right, and of course everyone's guessing here, but given these are the people actually running retail stores, I would kind of trust that. So I think your scenario C captures that pretty well. And I also reached out to different hotels in the city as well, and like you, I asked them, hey, so what kind of projections do you see? They told me what the numbers that you just told me, which lines up. But I pressed them because I really want to know, like, so what do you think we're going to see in terms of business, right, over the next fiscal year? And frankly, I think that given that there's a really strong correlation between TOT and hotels, the TOT numbers are low, right? At least in the opinions of people I've talked with. Now, everyone's guessing here. We don't really know for sure. These are all projections. So just looking at these numbers, I would love for scenario B to happen, but what retailers are telling me, what restaurants are telling me, restaurants are saying, look, I'm not sure I would even open again because some of them are just going bankrupt. That's one thing. But the other big issue is that even if they can open, they have to space every other table, right? I mean, a lot of these restaurants run on low single digit margins, and if you lose like 50% of your revenue or 75% of your revenue, it's like super duper hard to even reopen because you can't run a business profitably, right? Especially at the higher minimum wage. So first of all, we have businesses that are getting wiped out already, right? I heard that Mayfield's going bankrupt, right? And a bunch of other businesses or restaurants are going bankrupt and retailers are going bankrupt. So we're going to lose some businesses just because they're not going to survive this, right? They just can't make it through. So there's a bunch of them that are just biting the dust right now. And then the ones that do kind of pull through, there's two issues going on. One issue is consumer sentiment, right? When people are losing their jobs, they can't pay rent, they're not going to go out and buy a Gucci bag, right? It's just not going to happen. They're not going to. Stanford Shopping Mall is a really upscale mall, very expensive. I mean, who's going to go out and spend $5,000 on a handbag? It's probably not going to happen. And then the second big thing is capacity, right? So a lot of these places have super restricted capacity. So even if I'm actually looking at scenario C as the best case scenario where end of this month we start opening up, right? The city, the county starts opening up. People start trying to get to business normal. The big challenge is that there's still going to be some social distancing happening. There's 30 million people have lost their jobs already, and a lot of people are even more worried about losing their jobs. So we're approaching unemployment numbers like the Great Depression. So, we are in general kind of an upscale area. Our restaurants are expensive, our retailers are expensive. So I don't see a big rush of a big, V-shaped type recovery. We're going to bounce right back because of the fact that there's all this kind of, basically the economy is kind of seizing up, and it's tough for businesses to get the business they had before. So so on the hotel side, the other thing I've been looking at is, so what are trade shows and conferences doing? So what are the ones planning to do later this year? And pretty much all the major trade shows are getting canceled and pulled. A lot of the hotels, a like all these galas. I mean, will we have Christmas parties? I don't know, right? I hope so. But there's all these kind of things that used to happen that brought in revenue to these hotels or caterers. That's not going to happen anymore, or won't happen for some time. So, I mean, just my own calculation, I think scenario C is actually kind of optimistic. I mean, I wish it wasn't. I see scenario C not as a, you know, we stay closed till winter, but I see it like we open in May, but it's going to be a slow start. It's going to be very, very tough for businesses to get the business that they used to have, and so I almost think there should be a scenario D, but we could use a C right now because I don't want to be such a downer here. But I in the numbers in the research I've done, it's not looking good. I think it's going to be really tough. And then I read some of the reports from the economists out there, and they're all projecting pretty dire numbers. So I hope we could do scenario C. I think scenario B would be amazing if we could do. I don't think that's realistic at all. So the other thing is, and this is kind of a question for our CFO here. So I know there's a lot of focus here on the general fund, which I totally understand, but I'm also with what Councilmember Philsa said, which is right now I think some of the revenue is not being counted because we're thinking, or not being down forecasted, because the thought is, well, it's offset by commensurate expense cuts, but that's not necessarily true, right? Because a lot of this are employees, and we would have to renegotiate contracts or lay people off. And so I actually agree with Councilmember Philsa in terms of what he said. We need to see all the revenue sources because there's not an automatic cut in expenses. We would like there to be, right? But just because, for instance, development fees drop doesn't mean we cut all the staff in the development center. That's not what happens. We still have all these people. We still have to go through, you know, contract negotiations and all this bargaining stuff. And so I think actually what's more prudent is for us, because this is the general fund, just one of many funds that the city has, and one of the many different revenue sources that we have. But it's not like all the other expenses we have just get automatically collapsed down if we have less revenue. I mean, ideally it does, but it doesn't scale like that. So I think Councilmember Philsa made a really good point about that. And so I would actually like us, as we do the budget process, to actually see a downward forecast of all the revenues, so that when we make decisions, we're making decisions with more complete information. Because right now we're looking at just one small fund in our overall budget. So anyways, I know you're not gonna do that right now, but that's something I think would be important to have by the 11th. And then, I guess, so Santa Monica, which is very similar to our city, except it's bigger, has had, massive revenue shortfalls. And I've been kind of doing some comparisons to them. And like, for instance, I looked at what they said their hotels will drop. They think it would drop about 42%, right? This is Santa Monica. So I think I would also encourage you guys to look at other city forecasts, because it would show you that scenario C is like most likely what there is to happen. And I don't know if you guys have already started doing that, but if not, you probably should, because I don't think we're going to do much better than C. So I think we should get the fees, we should get the other funds in here, even the utility funds, because I know we're doing deferrals for people. So we need to kind of know all of that. And while I think the property tax is probably fairly accurate in terms of its projection, although I guess I'll just say it's probably okay for now. I think there's a lag for that. So I think there's going to be a drop in property values, at least from the realtors I talk with. I mean, it's hard for people to show houses. Some of the houses were bought by people who were overseas. I mean, they can't really travel here anymore. So we're going to get compression on those pricing as well. So we probably have to think about not just fiscal year 2021, but also 2022, because there's also probably going to be a dip in property taxes by then, because there's a bit of a lag. But anyways, this is much better than before, which we just had just one big massive number that we didn't know what was in it. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, we have Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this isn't business as usual, and this isn't a drill. I so appreciate what the staff has done to date under really extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I think though it's been primarily a supply side analysis, I guess if you would call it that. And I'm not sure, the report at the time of the report, they were, the statement was that C was probably too extreme. But I'm not sure that the analysis has taken into full consideration what I think are going to be the changes on the demand side. So I know people who won't travel until there's a vaccine. I know people who refuse to get takeout from restaurants today here in Palo Alto. We all know people who live with people who are at high risk based on their age or whether or not they have an autoimmune condition or diabetes. And when you start expanding those, I think the difference between a business reopening and a business achieving the same level of income that allows them to, revenue that allows them to pay taxes, I think it's going to be a long time before we get back to normal. And the normal will be different. I spoke a little bit earlier when we talked about the business roundtables about some of the changes that businesses will have to make. And I think the ones that I really want to focus on are visitors. So I hope that the community has learned from this situation how highly dependent we are at the margin on visitors. Visitors who stay at our hotels, who shop at Stanford and Town and Country, and eat out at this a crazily amazing variety of restaurants that we have. And the difference between this crisis and prior ones that we've had in this century are it's really truly global. And we're, a place that is a huge destination for people. So as I take that sort of like, how will people feel about going places and how large an environment will they be willing to be in? And how much will there be domestic or international travel? And I layer that on top of this. I come to the reluctant conclusion that that C is the most appropriate scenario for us to use to make financial decisions for the upcoming year. I think the only other thing I wanted to ask about this is about the CalPERS impact. So can staff address how much, if we wanted to start saving for this impact, which will come in 2 years, but we know will be incurred now, do we have any idea what we should be saving now to prepare for that?
Well, thank you for the question, Council Member. You are correct. We will not see the impacts of that until fiscal year 2023. And then even then, you won't necessarily feel the full impact. CalPERS has a 5-year phase-in period. And so you will see whatever the impact is of the loss of the returns this year ramp over a 5-year period beginning in 2023. So 23, 24, 25, 26, you'll see the full impact in FY27, which is a little interesting to talk about at this moment in time. Now, based on the pension modeling tool that CalPERS provides, and looking at CalPERS returns as of right now, we sometimes check them daily. They are at 0% year to date in terms of their earnings, which means it's about $7 million when 2027 comes in additional payments. Now, that's a reminder that that's across all funds, not just general fund, and that assumes CalPERS stays at a 0% return this year. CalPERS currently has a discount rate of 7%. Obviously, we have money placed in a reserve for additional normal costs associated with the 6.2 lower discount rate. So we've done some work to close that gap already, since we're already expecting only 6% in returns as opposed to 7% in returns on our normal cost. But those are impacts that will be felt in the coming years.
And just to be clear, that's $7 million annually. That's not a one-time.
Correct. It would be $7 million, and it's a 20-year amortization period.
Okay. All right. I think in thinking about that is, frankly, would be a higher priority for me than matching the changes in service expenses because those map together. So I would be less interested in staff spending time on that and more interested in staff spending time on the pension liability on a personal basis. And then just my final remark is I'm so glad that you brought up Stanford earlier because however and whenever Stanford reopens has a really big impact on these two things that are so sensitive, right? The transient occupancy tax and the sales tax. And it doesn't matter whether they're conferences or sports games or reunions or, you know, graduate schools or undergraduate. I think, you know, that's another thing that we're learning in this process is how connected we are to the Stanford community. So I will end there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next is Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yeah, so again, thanks to staff as we start to look at making some extremely hard, difficult choices. I have a few questions, and then I guess we'll go on to another round. So I did notice in your table that you showed changes versus fiscal year 20 and the estimated fiscal year 21 proposed. And those large drops are against the proposed FY21. And those had built-in increases, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So some of those cuts are expenses we were planning, but we hadn't actually incurred. Not that it makes it easier, but they're slightly lower in terms of when you look at versus FY20. I think Councilmember Felsleth and Tanaka both touched on the charge for services. I wanted to give you a chance to answer. So how will we make sure that we don't get our fixed staff expenses kind of ahead of the fees and charges revenue?
Diligent management. Realistically, all directors, frankly, are monitoring their financials in their departments extremely closely at this point. No hire goes without, frankly, a director or even Ed knowing about it because we want to make sure that we're ensuring that flexibility. And, you know, for example, in CSD, we have summer programs and, you know, we typically would be staffing up right now. But obviously we're not doing that. Now, should things open and summer programs continue, we will quickly figure out how to make that work. But in the absence of knowing that's going to happen, we're not committing ourselves to those expenses by bringing on new staff or new contractors. So
Right.
It really is an active management scenario that we're taking on in those areas to make sure that we're doing our very best. And then the other piece that I'll just add is in certain areas, staff is already expecting declines, like I mentioned in the development center. And we're already looking at how we would reimagine those services and we'll proactively bring forward reductions both in costs as well as services, revenues, costs and revenues to the full council next week as part of our revised assumptions.
Great. Yeah, I mean, government's not always the fastest moving of organizations, but I think it's really important that we keep communicating this with the public so they understand that we are watching this kind of stuff. So I want to say I did like the scenarios, like the verbal descriptions. It was a little bit difficult sometimes to see how those map to the assumptions. So the description of scenario B sounded pretty good, but like a lot of council members have said, particularly the TOT drop didn't seem realistic. It seemed too small. And I think one thing I just wanted to confirm that, you know, when we talk about TOT, when we see a drop in occupancy rates, we usually also see a drop in average daily rates. So it's kind of a double whammy, right?
That's correct.
Okay. The last question I had was, you know, as we move forward here, and I think, you know, some of us are more pessimistic than others. You know, we have to kind of come to a group decision, but when will we have data indicating kind of which scenario is actually happening? Like, we're going to make some cuts. Are we going to have to wait 6 months to adjust?
To adjust, meaning based on updated data?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that part of the direction council can provide, and it doesn't necessarily need to be tonight, but as we move through this budget process, is a time frame for staff to come back and continually provide updates. I would say either to the finance committee or to the full council. Staff already, as part of our regular work, do quarterly financial reports, either as an item with finance committee or an info item to the full council. And obviously, we are just as eager as the council is to make sure that we get these revenue estimates correct so that we can accordingly address the expense side, positive or negative. So you can believe that staff will be monitoring these closely, and as things change, be bringing updates to the council based on any of those data changes that may arise as we move through this.
Okay. So I just make some really quick comments. You know, tonight we're really setting the trajectory for the budget. You know, we're talking about the revenue side, not necessarily diving into specific expense cuts tonight, but the revenue target we set is really going to determine how deep those cuts are to balance the budget. You know, we've already used up, or we will have used up, half of our budget stabilization reserve, you know, by the time this current year is over in mid-calendar year. And again, I hope that we can, as a group, stay focused on some kind of top-level principles. You know, none of us can see the future, so I think some of us are going to be pessimistic, some are going to be less so. And I think the more we can listen to each other and take inputs, we'll make a solid decision as a group. And kind of tied into that is, you know, I think we need to realize we're trying to get a reasonable estimate as we can, but we may not make all the cuts at once. And, you know, I think we're just starting to grasp implications, and we don't know how long really this is going to last. Could be 12 months, could be 18 months, could be 3 years. And we'll need to think about structural changes probably over many months. I do hope we stay focused on the big ticket items, you know, and I see those as kind of, you know, department cuts, focusing on the largest departments the most. This issue about capital transfer, and then we really need to talk about how quickly we want to refresh our reserves. You know, if we get hit by another emergency, another earthquake, we can't have, or another earthquake, we can't just be sitting here with no reserves. So, you know, those are kind of 3 big buckets. And then I hope as we go through these budget meetings next week, we can stay focused on dollar amounts. You know, percentages can be misleading. And so for me, I'm kind of falling somewhere between B and C, kind of leaning more towards C. And I would echo some other comments that I didn't really see it as an extremely conservative scenario, but more of a pragmatic one in terms of what we've been hearing and reading about. You know, no one is talking about large events coming back in the fall, except if you rent out a private island or all of Las Vegas or some scenarios like that. And so I'd have to say, you know, I'm really leaning more towards $35 to $40 million of cuts this year. And I guess I'll stop there and we can talk about it again in the next round.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Councilmember Koo.
I think it was Councilmember Filsef first, but
I'm going through everybody, and then
okay.
Go back for another round.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for this. I wanted to ask, so can you remind me about internet sales tax? Is that part of the sales tax that's listed over here? How much do we, especially now that we're in this shelter in place, you know, and all the stores are mostly closed, even for groceries, while they're essential, there's still a lot of people that are ordering it, goods and groceries online. So is that part of the sales tax number that is on the chart?
That's correct. When we look at sales tax, we do look at all sectors, including internet sales.
Okay. So, okay, that's okay. Then also in your scenario for B and C, I guess your C includes the scenario where more or less if we expect that second wave, that's going to come in the winter time. So then the inclusion of the cost of the housing for homeless as well as the cost of utilities, which we may have to defer, might be also forthcoming in the next session that we're going to be looking at, or is it already in this chart as well in terms of reductions? This is all revenue, right?
This is all revenue. So we haven't looked at the expense side. We'll look at the expense side next week with the council beginning May 11th.
Okay. And then I guess I could ask those questions then. And if anything, I would like to kind of mention some of the principles not to forget about where there is about how our community, you know, in terms of things like traffic enforcement, those kind of things I think that we want to maintain, as well as code enforcement. And then there's the ARB reviews, you know, those are cost recovery costs. Things that are of value and beneficial in terms of livability as well as quality of life. Please, you know, keep those as principles and qualities that we want to make sure that we maintain. Besides that, I think most of the questions have been asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Koo. So a couple of comments, a few small questions. So as I mentioned at the beginning here, our goal is really to set a financial scenario for the community, for our staff, and for the council. Somebody mentioned, you know, we can't see the future, and there's very limited information, quickly changing facts, and as the Vice Mayor said, you know, we all have different levels of pessimism or optimism around certain scenarios and or revenues. And I appreciate, for instance, Councilmember Tanaka reaching out to some other cities and talking to some other hotels. I think those are helpful data points. It remains to be seen, you know, when they really come into clarity and how they affect our revenues. And unfortunately, those are lagging numbers for us, in some cases by a matter of years. You know, the specifics of what we choose will be published this Thursday evening. And it will depend on the scenarios we choose tonight. And I do want to highlight to my colleagues, you know, scenario C is, for lack of a better term, pretty brutal for our city government and the services we will be offering. And the things that Councilmember Koo just mentioned, you know, ARB reviews, code enforcement, the traffic team, everything's going to suffer. And, you know, over the past week, I've heard, you know, that we need to save the crossing guards, we need to save the animal shelter, we need to save recreational programs, we need to save the housing work plan, we need to save the traffic team. Everyone is something they love. And a lot of it is not going to make it through this. And that said, we need to approach this as a network problem. There are a lot of interdependencies in our city government, both in terms of staffing and the programs that we offer. And I think, as I've been thinking about this the past few days, you know, there's an appeal for all of us to, you know, go deep, be conservative, cut a lot. I think that can be politically appealing, but not necessarily the right course of action if we overcut. And I think at the same time that will lead to, it could lead to a bad problem of political horse trading on the back end, where we cut deeply and then we each have our sacred cow that we try to trade off in the next few weeks. And I don't want us to get there. At the same time, I don't want us to undercut and go shallow and then potentially come back in September and, you know, have this stop, start, restart problem. So it's important for us to really, you know, move intelligently between the strategic decisions like tonight and the tactical decisions like we'll have next week. And as the Vice Mayor mentioned, I really do hope we can show some teamwork in this and not try to, you know, identify specific things that we think are important. Let's let staff do the work of taking our strategic instruction and developing a budget plan that works for the whole city and community. A few things that folks have mentioned that I'm also interested in, the interrelationships with capital improvements and what a different scenario choice will do there. You know, does scenario choice B impact specific projects? Does scenario choice C, you know, impact them further or additional projects? I think that's something that needs to come into clarity. Agree with the Vice Mayor. I like the scenarios in terms of just an idea, a story, a narrative about what our budget looks like. I will say I was also a little confused about how they map to specific budget items. A question to the city manager and our budget chief, I guess, is what would potentially trigger additional cuts? Like, is there a timeline for when you think we will have more information? Is that like, you know, July, September, December? What would make us think about additional cuts if we find we've undershot our targets?
You know, I think that is an area that staff should give some further thought. You know, it occurred to me through this discussion this evening that the next quarterly report, such as it is, will just verify what we already know, which was the last quarter was pretty brutal. And so given that, I'm not sure that there would be much actionable difference. Let's say a quarter from now, certainly 6 months from now, it would be a clearer picture. At least we would hope that we would see some signs of recovery in that time period, although even in that sense, I think it's something that we should really look further into. But just to give you some initial thoughts, I think that that might be appropriate to share.
Okay. Another question I just had written down. Do we foresee any talk about state backfills of any of these revenues or other sources?
Well, there's certainly been discussion at the federal level of assistance to cities smaller than 500,000 population, given that the CARES Act was focused on cities and counties over 500,000. The prospect of that, I haven't heard the latest, but it certainly wasn't moving quickly. So given that, you know, I do think that there is some discussion, but not anything that we could count on at this point.
Okay. So I'm gonna, as I think about the scenarios, I'm with some of my colleagues, I'm kind of in between B and C. On the one hand, I think C may hit some of the right numbers in terms of the severity of impact on things like the transit occupancy tax and sales tax. But anecdotally, in terms of the story, I'm a little closer to B in that, you know, already we see in some states and here in California too, certain easing of the shelter-in-place orders. And so, you know, as I said, none of us are prognosticators, but I have a hard time imagining those orders staying in place through December. I'm somewhere in between, you know, spring and winter, right? So call it fall. So that's why I'm kind of on B/C. Staff had listed in the staff report, build an FY21 proposed budget, assuming scenario B with a tier 2 plan. Is the tier 2 plan, is that just part of that scenario, B/C, or is there something else going on there?
Well, it is, but what we can do is essentially carve out discretely that difference. So if I just take the math and say council gave direction to staff to do to balance FY21 based on a $20 million revenue loss, and then a tier 2 plan of an additional 10 million, what we can do is provide what's in the 20 million and then what would be in that additional 10, so that there's almost two buckets. They would need to obviously build on each other, but we've done this, or I've done it frankly in other agencies where we have a level of uncertainty, so that when council takes action on a budget, they take action on all of it, tier 1 and tier 2, and tier 2 is only triggered under certain instances. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is you just automatically know kind of what your reinstatement list is. If you went full bore and said, okay, adopt a budget based on a $30 million reduction target, but know that this is the first 10 million that would be reinstated. Ultimately, it's just a way to kind of splice and dice what the proposals brought forward would be, and the implementation timeframe of them.
Sure. So I know it's a long way off, but I think we should actually to some degree consider the reinstatement list and what that looks like in case that's not an opportunity for us. So that's kind of where I am. I guess we can go around for another thing, but I do see some hands, and assuming there will probably be some motions. First one I saw was Councilmember Filseth.
Yeah, thanks very much. I actually thought Councilmember Tanaka had a number of very good insights, and I liked his description of, scenario B story, but scenario C numbers with it, and I think that's probably the most likely. And so I'm sort of gravitating towards the scenario C numbers, which are appalling, but it is what it is. And, if you look at the TOT, for example, normally our hotel occupancies were at 90% and now they're at 10%. And so if you hand wave figured that, well, for the first half of fiscal 21, they would be at 10%, and the second half of fiscal 21, they'd be at 90% again, then that would be a 50% drop or 45% drop or something like that for the year. And it's probably better than 10% in the first half of the year and not as good as 90% in the second half of the year. But, sort of that 40 to 50% drop range for a TOT seems realistic to me under the description of scenario B, even if things started to open up now. And so, I think Councilmember Cormack has an important point that we are somewhat dependent on travel, maybe more than some other jurisdictions. And we need to think about how fast that comes back in. And then finally, charges for service is a fairly substantial item. It's $30 million a year. And so it's not entirely unrealistic, I think, to think that, that 38.8 number, actually should have another couple million added to it for the shortfall in charges for services. And we're going to take that up on the expense side too, but since we're just dealing with the revenue scenario here. And finally, we lost $20 million in 1/3 of fiscal 20. So it doesn't seem wildly unrealistic to me that we might lose 40 million in all of fiscal 21. So I'm sort of leaning in, I'm in the scenario C numbers camp. And probably the scenario more close to the scenario B story. But from a planning perspective, I think we ought to be, in that range. Hope for better, of course, and keep an eye on it. But from a planning perspective, I think that's the direction we ought to go.
Thank you, Councilmember Filseth. I just want to do a quick programming note. Given the hour, it's 10:15. We are going to move item 3 to May 18th. So that is a discussion of Senate Bill 743. Just given the hour that we have this item to finish up and one more. Councilmember Tanaka.
Sure. So I kind of did the same math as Councilmember Filseth. So it's scenario C really is the narrative description of scenario B, unfortunately. And while we might wish for better numbers, we can't plan for a wish. We have to do what is probably most realistic. In fact, if I was to, I actually think my version of scenario C is actually worse than what's here. So if I was to actually do it, I would actually have even a bigger loss than this. But I'll be an optimist here and say let's say it's scenario C. I think in the best case scenarios we're going to get scenario C. I don't think it's going to be I don't think it's a pessimistic case. I think that, and also sooner we are able to adjust this, the better, because as the Vice Mayor said, we're going to be burning through half of our reserve by the end of this fiscal year, and that doesn't give us much runway, because when we're out of reserves, we will have to make drastic, we are not the federal government, we can't print money, right? We're going to have to make drastic cuts. There's going to be very little time to plan. So I think right now it's most prudent for us to actually have a realistic scenario, hope for better numbers, try to do what we can to try to get businesses reopening and stuff going again. So we could try to get scenario C. And so, yeah, so I'll make the motion that we go with scenario C.
So there's a motion on the floor. Is there
Second.
Okay, thank you. Motion by Councilmember Tanaka to go forward with scenario C, seconded by Councilmember Filseth. Do you want to speak to your motion, Greg?
I kind of did. You know, I think that. I think that you know, I in the last meeting there were a bunch of potential expenses cut. I mean, proposed expense cut. I think when we get into it, I think what's really important is for us to look at the biggest expenses first, and then work our way down in terms of priority. And I think by having a more realistic scenario, it will help us make these decisions as to what it needs to be. And I think there's actually better ways of versus like taking out crossing guards. Maybe we should go for like pay reductions, right, as an example. So there's a lot of other ways we could slice this, but we're not here to talk about that tonight. So anyways, I think I said enough on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Filseth.
No, I think I've already spoken to it, and now I need to go throw up.
Be sure to turn off your video. Okay, thank you, Councilmember Filseth. So next, I saw hands from Vice Mayor Du Bois, Councilmember Cormack, Councilmember Niss.
Yeah, so unfortunately and painfully, I agree and leaning towards scenario C. And I'll support that motion. Again, we're setting the trajectory for the budget, and so just really quickly, I wanted to circle over those kind of three big areas: kind of department cuts, capital transfers, reserve policy. You know, I really think, you know, playing around with the numbers, we're looking at something like 20% cuts overall on department expenses. I do think we need to kind of keep everything on the table. You know, where possible, if we can look at maybe increasing fees, and you know, and really considering some things where we have large fixed costs like our libraries. Can we reduce hours? Can we use volunteer staff to keep providing some of those services, but in a lower cost way? Even things like again, our management structure, how many employees per manager. I think we need to look at that kind of stuff. On the capital transfers, we talked about it last time. We're going to have to really prioritize those projects, decide which ones we continue, which ones we pause. I think a balance is important. You know, we shouldn't just pause everything. I did want to point out that, you know, we should consider, you know, when we sign some construction contracts and see if we can renegotiate as bids go down. Just a reminder that during the .com crash, we saw lower construction bids in less than a year. And then on the reserve policy, you know, I'm definitely leaning towards trying to refill it in kind of a 3 to 5 year time frame. I think it was mentioned slightly, but I think the public really needs to recognize that how our revenue structure differs from maybe other cities, even those near us. Mountain View gets a good chunk of revenue from leases to Google in the North Bay Shore, so that's pretty solid. They're not going to see the same kinds of impacts that we're seeing so quickly. Redwood City has a larger portion of their budget from property tax, and as we said, that's going to lag a year, so they're not going to feel some of that pain maybe until next year. You know, and again, we're talking about a $40 million cut in the overall general fund budget. And staffing expenses are our largest expense category. So I think we're talking about a pretty large part of that coming out of our staff. And I think the public needs to understand that that's likely going to be across the board. It's going to be our management. It's going to be our unionized staff. And we do have to work through some steps with our labor workforce and our unions to kind of work on those cuts together. You know, the remaining cuts, you know, I said it before, we should look at our largest ticket items. I think we really need to look at our largest consulting agreements and And again, look at, do we expect actually some of our forecasted expenses to drop? We saw, public works projects drop pretty quickly in the past. I also, if people are watching this meeting, I think we really need to leverage our community. Palo Alto has a history of doing that with Avenidas, Theater Works, Junior Museum, Friends of the Library. So I think we should expect a greater role from our kind of non-government organizations. And we may need to think big. Are there some functions that we could continue through forming, a new nonprofit, or are there some services we could potentially shift and do jointly with other cities rather than just doing it ourselves? I agree with the statements about we need to keep an eye on our pension payments, and our additional payments into our 115 fund. And it's kind of longer term. It's probably after we get through the budget talks next week. But really starting to think about what changes are likely to be pretty long lasting, and how does that impact some of our programs and policies. Businesses are going to need to have a plan to ensure that workers are protected, whether that's through social distancing or more telecommuting. And so are we going to have fewer commuters? Is telecommuting going to catch on for sustained time? And again, talking to some of our retailers and our services, they are concerned, as the economy comes back, that shoppers will be able to park and get to their businesses easily. So once we get through the money stuff, I think we're going to have a bunch of policy stuff we need to talk about as well. So thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the maker and seconder. It certainly gives me no pleasure to support this, but it's the right thing to do. Fundamentally, hope is not a plan, and we need to plan appropriately. So I'll just echo a few things on the long term. We talked about pensions. I think I said this last week or the week before. There are a few other things I think that are long range problems we have, whether it's sea level rise or the train crossings. And I don't want us to not make progress on those this year, because those problems are not going away. In terms of capital projects, I think it's more important for us to first choose what's on the list, and then second, figure out how much money we can move over. And they're related, but I don't want us to focus on the number first and then figure out where that goes. I want us to figure out what we need to do, not what we want to do, but what we need to do, and then figure out how to move the money over. So in that order. And then, the most important thing for people, and I've really been gratified since Friday. So many people have reached out and said they have a better understanding now of why we're going to lose so many programs and services this next year, and that they do understand. Those are delivered by people. They're delivered by the people who work for this city. And they're just inextricably linked. The programs and services are the same because they're delivered by the people. So I want everyone to understand that. And I think we are, unfortunately making progress in terms of people understanding it. Next week is going to be very difficult, and it's going to be really hard for all of us, and for our employees, and for the people who live here. So I want us all to take a deep breath as we make this decision tonight, because the impacts will be felt starting next week.
Thank you. Councilmember Niss.
It's the muting and the unmuting. So I think what we're doing tonight is what makes sense, but won't make any sense a week from now. So some of the things that we're talking about cutting, we're talking about community service, we're talking about a fire, we're talking about our libraries, we're talking about cuts that we're going to make in art, open space, other other things that we really prize. Are we really going to cut back on our police, our public works, and planning and development, which is an area where we've said actually we need more people, not fewer people? So when we start to make real cuts next week, which we will do, it won't be like saying, should we do 25 or 30 or 35 or 45? Instead, we will actually be applying that to what we are going to cut. I can remember trying to cut library hours one year. We gave up on it, to be honest. It was just too painful. It came from something else. Things that involve our kids, our children's theater, our art classes, our interactions with the school district. It will be a really unpleasant week next week. And I think what I'm, and actually have a question about, is looking at Ed, where you might be, or maybe even Beth, how do we anticipate that we're going to hear from the public? In the same way we've done it before, as we are now?
This is Beth. Yeah, I think we'll be doing it the same way we're doing it in the Zoom meetings now, is allowing them to speak during the meetings.
So,
and I could add to that, that's certainly one form. We will also be ramping up our ability to do additional outreach so that members of the public are informed and can weigh in through means beyond the council meetings themselves. I think to the extent time allows, we'll also try to do some hard copy mailings, but use all tools at our disposal given the time we have between now and the budget adoption.
I think people will be very unhappy if they don't get to speak to us. I'm not sure. I'm also wondering though, Ed, as we get to June, if we are allowed to open in June, would there be any chance of actually meeting in City Hall when we're making the cuts with social distancing enforced?
Sure, we'll have to look at the protocols that are in place at the time, and maybe with some microphones, as the case may be, if we're all 6 feet apart. But such as it is, we'll certainly make all efforts and take whatever steps we can to make sure that the public has the opportunity to be heard.
Okay, I think that's going to really be important because, as we have said, when we start hearing from police and fire, and about protection that we provide in the city, that's going to be tough. But I think that which involves especially kids and our special outdoor activities, that's going to be even harder. So with that, I'm going to support the motion, although I'm not sure we're going to end up with that draconian motion eventually. However, it'll be a good start. Thanks, Mayor Fine.
Thank you. Councilmember Koo?
Thank you. I just wanted to also add, so a lot of things has already been said, so I'm not going to say it again, but I wanted to ask staff as we go into next week to be sure that you reach out to PAUSD in coming up with some realignment with some of the different programs that we have with them. So please make sure that that is before we meet. And so Councilmember Nis has already mentioned about, how to be sure to communicate with the community and ensure that they're participating in all of this. It's a very sobering and heartbreaking scenario to see, but I think in this situation, we do have to think conservatively, and I will support this motion too.
Thank you, Councilmember Koo. So just a couple comments. I'll support this. I think what convinces me is what Councilmember Tanaka said, is that, scenario B, the narrative makes sense, but he thinks the financial impacts are more aligned with scenario C. I think that's about right. I just really want to highlight to everyone again, we are not going to get to choose with this level of cuts. whether we start with the largest budget items or the smallest ones, whether you want to look at big consulting contracts, whether you want to preserve community services, whether you want to put money towards our pension plan, this scenario, you don't get to pick, right? Everything is going to be on the cutting floor. So I just hope we're all ready for that. And as the Vice Mayor said, I hope we can show some teamwork here on this. We're facing a different scenario than many other cities in our region. The Vice Mayor mentioned Redwood City and Mountain View. I'll just note, and getting political for a second, one of the reasons those cities aren't facing such serious budget cuts is they've been building commercial and residential space over the past few years, and they've been expanding their property tax bases. So that's the situation we're in Palo Alto, where we haven't done that. All right, let's vote on this motion, please. Councilmember Cormack.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Reluctantly, yes.
Councilmember Filseth.
Yes.
Myself is yes. Councilmember Niss. Councilmember Niss, I think you're on mute. Still on mute.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Koo.
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Yes.
Okay, that passes unanimously. Do want to thank staff very much for this really good report and presentation. I know there's a lot of hard work to come, and all of us on council and the community will be looking to you all for your expertise and professionalism working through this really difficult.
Fine. Could you mention when the meetings are going to be held around the budget so the public can jot it down?
Mr. City Manager, can you highlight those? I mean, I know next week we start,
Yeah.
but exact dates.
It will begin next week as part of your regular agenda on Monday, the 11th. Then it will proceed on both Tuesday and Wednesday, the 12th and 13th. The meetings are currently both scheduled to begin at 1 p.m. and run, I think, at least until 8 p.m. We'll schedule as we can within those slots.
Thank you so much. Let's message that out publicly as soon as we can. We have those dates and Zoom links. Okay, it's 10:30. We have one item left. We moved item 3 out. So let's move on to item number 11, staff update and request for direction on the details of a small business grant program.
Yes, if I could ask City Clerk's office, I believe, to assist with the PowerPoint. I'll do a quick overview and then really just turn it over to the council for your discussion on the particulars of this program. Would note this is also a referral back from prior council direction for staff to bring a program back to you. And let's see if we can get the PowerPoint up. Thank you, Jessica. Next slide, please. Great. So the basic outline per the prior council direction was to bring back a grant or loan program with the rough outline of $500,000 in city funding focused on businesses with 50 or fewer employees, and direction to look at seeking a third-party administrator or partner through which to develop the program. And we've identified a few particular parameters that we would like council guidance on this evening. First is the criteria for businesses that could qualify for a grant. Second is the method through which the selection would be reached among the pool of qualified applicants. Third is the amount of the grant and any restrictions on purpose. Fourth is to authorize the city manager to choose a grant administrator, recognizing we've still got a few options in that area. And then finally, to amend the budget this evening to reflect grant funding. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you a quick thumbnail of the key elements that we've identified And we've put forward some recommendations on each of these dimensions. The first would be that in order to qualify, a business would need to have between 1 and 50, as we refer to it, W-2 employees, so contract employees would not qualify. Second, that these would be for storefront businesses only, businesses that have a physical presence, and we had identified a number of specific professional services that would be excluded from this definition. Third, that the grant opportunity would be available both for for-profit as well as nonprofit organizations. I know this may be a point of some council discussion. Fourth, that business registration or registration as a business in Palo Alto, part of our business registry, would be required as part of qualifying for this grant. Fifth, that the business must have been in Palo Alto for at least 12 months, so an established business in the city. And then finally, that the business would be able to demonstrate at least a 25% loss in revenue as a result of the COVID-19 health emergency. And let's see, last slide, again, would be to have the selection occur via a lottery in which the qualified businesses would be invited to identify themselves, submit applications, and be assigned a lottery number. Next, that the grant amount would be up to $10,000 to cover 2 months of costs, and that there would not be any restrictions on the use of the funds. Third, that we would authorize this manager to choose the grant administrator, again, with a few options still being evaluated. I will share with you that with respect to our primary focus would be that we would partner with the Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce as a donation partner. And so with the chamber, be able to put together a portal for donors to support businesses in Palo Alto. And at this point, it looks like the grant administrator might actually be run via in-house staff rather than using a third party, just recognizing that as the city were to disperse funds, that there are a number of areas of paperwork that we would require in any case, to the point that it may be just as cost effective for us to keep that role in-house. And then finally, to amend our budget in order to appropriate the $500,000 necessary to move as quickly as we can on this program. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I turn it back to you for council questions and discussion.
Sure, thank you. You know, in our pre-council meeting, we had a brief discussion this morning about this, that we should potentially just not do official formal disclosures, but just describe our own personal business interactions. So I'll just kick it off and we can go alphabetically. So I work for a company, Autonomic, and based in Palo Alto, but we have over 50 employees and would not be eligible for this program. And so if any of you want to share, I'll just go alphabetically, but feel free or not. Councilmember Cormack?
I have nothing to report.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Du Bois?
I work for a company with over 50,000 employees, so not an issue.
Great. Councilmember Filseth?
Nothing to report.
Thank you. Councilmember Niss?
Nothing to report.
Councilmember Koo?
I'm a realtor and I don't have any employees and I don't qualify. I'm 1099.
Thank you. Councilmember Tanaka?
We don't have a retail storefront.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we do that for hygiene's sake. Let's go.
Could I add one more thing for the public, Mr. Mayor?
Sure, please.
So in looking further at these issues, we did identify that there is actually a state law that would prevent any council member from participating in this grant program. It's called Section 1090 of the Government Code. So just to reassure all members of the public that this program is for Palo Alto businesses, not including any business owned by a council member or their spouse. Thanks.
Thank you so much, City Attorney. That seems totally appropriate. Let's please go to any members of the public who wish to speak to this item.
Are there any members of the public wishing to speak to this item? If so, raise your hand. I don't see any, Mayor. Fine.
Okay, thank you. Let's return to council. The first hand I saw was Councilmember Niss, followed by the Vice Mayor.
So make sure I'm muted, invisible, and all of the above. So to make some comments back, first of all, I'm delighted that we're doing it. It's a little late, but I think that can be compensated for. I wanted to start with a couple of things. I noticed that there are nonprofits, contributions to nonprofits on top of this. And Councilmember Cormack may want to add to this as well. But the Community Foundation has made now over $800,000 in not only contributions for food and so forth, but also to nonprofits. And they find it difficult to give to nonprofits, and they have asked somebody else to help them with distributing to nonprofits. I would prefer that we kept ours to the purity of just what we described: retail, ground floor. The chamber alone told us that there are 350 people in their organization, but I know there are hundreds of businesses in our community. So the number that will apply will be pretty staggering. I would like to see the same money for everyone, because I think it's going to get very difficult to make that differentiation. And I know at one point, Councilmember Cormack had said she wanted to give it to companies that she felt had the best chance of succeeding. I'm not sure that we can make that call with any ease. So mine would be for the whatever amount it is, 5,000 or 10,000, but the same for everyone. I'm guessing it's going to take 10,000 to make a major difference. I think now that we've waited this long, we shouldn't be too hasty, because this is going to take some time to be able to give this money away to this many people. So what I'm hoping is that we take it in an organized way, that it really does make a difference when it gets into the community. And maybe also, once we have started our own program, whatever we may call it, maybe others will donate as well and help swell our coffers. But I think for the moment, as I said, I'd hold it to only to people who are retail, ground floor, and so forth, not nonprofits, and keep the money at the same level. So my suggestions, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yeah, first of all, a big thank you to the staff. I really appreciated them putting this together so quickly, and it made a lot of sense. It was really a solid plan, so thank you, everybody that worked on it. We got some interesting emails from the public. There was one I thought had some really good ideas. If we're going to administer this internally, the suggestion was to consider a small committee of people who really know the city and could help with the selection process. And, we could have a diverse group. It could be young and old from all over the city, private and public. I think it would help eliminate any potential bias or places that certain people may frequent, that kind of thing. So I think it's something we could consider. And as part of that same email that came in, there was a suggestion that we just ask, what will they do with the money? I expect we'll actually be oversubscribed. So I think it might be good to have see some of those results and have a panel of humans kind of look at it. I agree with Councilmember Niss. I thought we actually voted in our last meeting not to include nonprofits. So I was surprised that they were there. I do think it potentially add complication for donations. Like, we're going to have to figure out what percentage of it is tax deductible for them. And I don't know if there's any other kind of side effects of mixing kind of profit and nonprofits in one program. So I would be supportive of making this purely for businesses, for-profit businesses. The other thing that just caught my eye was the idea that they had to be registered in the business registry by May 11th. which is, I guess, 7 days from now. And so is that enough time to get out the word to anyone that hasn't registered yet? If we think it is, it's okay, but we really need to communicate that. In terms of how much, I did like the idea of, you know, 5,000 for an essential business that is allowed to be open and 10,000 for somebody who's totally closed. I'll go along with the majority of the council opinion on that one. I did like the staff report of it's 2 months of operating expense up to $10,000. I think, again, for a very small business, if they get the money, 10,000 might be, you know, 6 months operating expense. So I think having that in there is a good clause. I think the lottery idea is also very good, but I think we need to establish a date for that lottery. I spent some time reading through the Facebook Small Business Grant Program. They required, you know, proof of incorporation and agreement to be bound by some legal terms as part of the program. And I think that's also a good idea if we can avoid any issues of fraud, or we have some recourse if somebody got some money that they shouldn't have gotten. We've seen that playing out kind of nationally. Yeah, I think those are my main comments. So I will let somebody else make the motion, but again, I strongly suggest we remove the nonprofit piece. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. I didn't see who was first between council members Tanaka and Cormac. Did you guys? Councilmember Tanaka.
I didn't see either, but yeah, so thank you, staff, for getting this together. I know that this is like light speed compared to what we normally have to do, but I think time is of the utmost importance. A lot of businesses, as we've been talking about, have been going under already. So this is definitely the right thing to do. I think the general structure of the program is right. I have to agree with my fellow council members that I think that we should probably get something together for nonprofits, but I think at this point in time, it's actually talking about our retail businesses in our city. So I think keeping it focused on that, I think would be a good thing. I think, again, like I said, speed is the most important. I would love to see something around like a business that would maximize the sales tax revenue back to the city, but I realize that makes it a little bit complex and hard to do, but that, to me, that could be an interesting criteria. I do think that we have to make sure that we don't have fraud or there's some sort of due diligence that happens. And I realize that that's not a little bit contradictory in terms of making it complex, but I think that's so maybe some sort of oversight committee makes sense, but it's just I'm trying to think of how to make this streamlined, because this program is something that our fellow city, Malview, has done like over a month ago now, right? And we're still talking about it. So, so anyways, those are just things I think that would make this a little bit stronger, but I don't feel that passionate about any one of these things, other than that I think we need to make it happen soon. So I will be supporting this. I except for the nonprofit part, I think that should be taken out. So yeah, so maybe I'll just make the staff recommendation excluding the nonprofit and see if that gets a second.
I'll second that. So Councilmember Tanaka has moved the staff motion, but to exclude the portion on nonprofits per our direction last week. Do you want to speak to your motion?
No, I think we've talked about this 3 times already, so I'm okay. Thank you.
Sure. Just briefly, although this is limited and as some people describe, certainly not enough, I think it is the right thing to do to support some of our businesses. A couple comments. I agree with my colleagues. I think staff did a really stellar job bringing this together in such a short time period. And I think a lot of the criteria that you put together are helpful. Agree that it should be focused on businesses. A couple small things, and I don't think it's worth building into the motion. I am kind of the feeling that I would rather see more businesses accessing small amounts of money than potentially up to the 10,000. I don't think it needs to go in here, and I think you've done a good enough job breaking it out. And then I do actually like the Vice Mayor's question of like, how are you going to use the money, right? I think that actually might be interesting just in terms of data collection. Like, is it being used for payroll? Is it being used for rent? Is it for supplies? I think that might be interesting and informative for us. But otherwise, I don't have much else to add here. Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Mayor Fine. When we contemplated doing this, I voted for the motion to contemplate it, but I reserved the right to vote against it. When I read the staff report, I was more inclined to support it, and I want to say why. We are in an extraordinary time, and in some ways, the usual rules don't apply. Sitting through the business roundtable and having a fuller picture of the range of problems, which are not just rent and employees, but include cost to restart, made me think, well, perhaps we could provide money to businesses that are trying to restart, because that's really what we want, right? We really want them to be able to come back. And then finally, I did my own little completely unscientific poll in the neighborhood and just asked people I know and people I don't know, hey, do you think the city should spend city money on helping small businesses? And people were uniformly supportive. And these are people who have a wide range of views on other things. So I don't understand the objection to nonprofits. If they're a nonprofit that has a storefront, I'm not sure why we wouldn't want to support them. I have never thought that this was about sales tax. I think it's about far more than that. So I also don't think it would make sense for a group of people to make the decision. I think that would introduce bias, and frankly, it would just cause delay. So I was very happy with the staff recommendation, but I don't believe that I'll be able to support it in this version.
Thank you. Just for clarification, is that because of the nonprofit issue?
Yes, but I see there are already 4 supporting it, so the math suggests that there's no reason to make any change.
Okay. Councilmember Koo.
Just a question about item D, the donation partner. Is that going out and seeking other organizations or companies that's willing to donate towards helping the small businesses?
Well, specifically on the partner, it would actually be the clearinghouse for both marketing as well as receiving donations. That would, again, be a partner. We are in discussions, as I mentioned, with the Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce, and it appears positive that they'll be able to help us in that regard.
Oh, very good. So it doesn't necessarily just mean that there's the 500,000, it's going to potentially be more.
Correct. Yes,
Very
that
good.
is the goal.
Okay, so I just want to mention that, Supervisor Samidian has a phone call that he does reaching out to citizens in his district. And the very first one that he did was at the beginning of April. And at the time, he had a poll where he asked 4 questions in terms of, who do the citizens put as a high priority? 1 is elderly and those that are at risk. 2 is hospital and medical staff and the response to surge capacity. 3 is the impact on the loss of jobs and the economy. And 4 is adequate education to students. On April 5th, the elderly was at 21% and the impact on jobs was 20%. When we came to, those were the highest, with the hospital and medical staff at 54% and education for students at 5%. On April 26th, the elderly and the impact on the loss of jobs was at 33% and 32% respectively. The hospital and medical staff and response to surge went down from 54% to 27%. So it's obvious to see that there is a huge concern on the recovery of our retail businesses and on the economy. So I think this is the right way to go, to provide some help to some of the community serving businesses that's in our town, wherever possible. I will be in support of this. Thank you. And I want to thank staff for coming up with this so quickly. It's actually very impressive what you did.
Agreed. Thank you, Councilmember Koo. Councilmember Niss?
Just because the nonprofit has come up a couple of times, the reason that I feel strongly to not include not-for-profits is having heard, as I said, talked with a couple of people from the Community Foundation who said they found it difficult to decide whether or not to give to nonprofits, and then decided that another nonprofit who was willing to handle it and oversee it had a much better understanding of that nonprofit and what their needs were and so forth. And they were quite definitive about it, which persuaded me. So it wasn't my own internal decision. It was from talking to other people who are also giving money away at this point. Giving money away, I think, is not easy, because the person who gets the money is delighted, and the person who didn't get the money is not only not delighted, but sometimes angry and very puzzled as to why they weren't selected. So that's why I'm so glad to see the lottery selection method is here. I think I made my arguments before. I'm going to vote for it, and I'm glad we're going to be offering it. And I think maybe we're doing it a little more in a slightly different way than Mountain View, which did have some trouble fairly early on because there were so many people who applied so quickly. So at this point, Ed, you're going to run it from within the city?
That's correct. That appears to be our most cost-effective approach.
Okay, and then and the lottery will be held within the city, or are you going to hold the lottery some other way?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the dimensions is our partner for the donations. And so we're talking to the chamber exactly how we would structure the oversight to ensure that both donors as well as, certainly from the city's perspective, that we have a fully transparent process. So we have some mechanics to work through here, but I suspect we'll be able to get that done fairly quickly. Now, on that basis, we'll also want to see how long it takes to spool up a donation portal and what the response is from the community. If the response is high, then I think we'll look at how to best time the actual lottery to maximize both the opportunity for members of the community to donate, as well as potentially 2 rounds if that is supportable. One last comment I want to make before, since it sounds like you're getting close to a vote, since there have been several compliments to the staff report, I do want to acknowledge the work of Heather Dollar in particular, who you normally hear related to our legislative efforts coming out of the utilities department as well as citywide. But Heather really did the heavy lifting in pulling together the program for tonight. So all the compliments can be deflected and fully received by her. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks for that explanation, Ed. As I said, the lottery is terrific, but hold it someplace where everyone knows that it was absolutely, untouchable as far as our being criticized in any way for how we chose the recipients.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Councilmember Filseth.
Well, I wanted to thank Heather as well. I thought the staff proposal here was excellent. I think you guys did a great job paring sort of all our ideas down into a coherent, lean program that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a worthwhile and worthy thing to do. And the place I'm struggling is, the appalling outlook we just settled on in the previous item, and we're going to be turning down worthy programs, right and left going forward. And so that's what I'm struggling with, is that on the one hand, I think this is a worthy program. On the second, it's going to make our problem 1% worse. And so that's what I'm struggling with here.
Well said. Okay, let's vote on this motion. Councilmember Cormack,
No.
Vice Mayor Du Bois,
Aye.
Councilmember Filseth,
No.
myself is yes. Councilmember Niss. You're on mute, Liz.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Ku,
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes, and I'm hoping this also helps our economy recover faster, so hoping
Yes.
there will be some payback as well.
understood. Thank you. Okay, that passes on a 5-2 vote with Councilmembers Cormack and Filseth voting no. Thank you, everyone. Just a few minutes past 11, finishing up our action calendar. Our study session has been moved out 2 weeks, so we'll get to that then. So we're going to go to council member questions, comments, and announcements. Please hit your lights, but first I want to go to the city manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Did want to take the opportunity to note for the council that in your informational reports for this evening, we do have a proclamation for in honor of William Warrior, who is retiring from 40 years of service with the city of Palo Alto. You have a proclamation with you this evening. I would note, I'd just like to share a few thoughts from the police chief and myself to note that a few thoughts from the police chief and myself to note that Bill Warrior was honorably and professionally serving the city of Palo Alto since 1979. Believe it or not, where were you in 1979? Over the span of his remarkable career, he has rescued and helped tens of thousands of stray, sick, and injured domestic and wild animals, investigated countless tragic cases of criminal animal abuse and neglect, and served as an ambassador and advocate for animals and wildlife throughout the Mid-Peninsula. He has been a trusted partner, a valued employee, and a friend. He is also the longest serving full-time employee in the 126-year history of this Palo Alto's police department, a feat that will likely never be surpassed. And I would just add on a personal note that recognizing that the last several years have been really difficult years for the animal shelter and animal control officers as we've transitioned to our service model. I really appreciated that throughout those challenging years that William Warrior has been a professional throughout. And so with that, I just appreciate the opportunity to spend a moment and reflect on and commend Mr. Warrior for his service.
Nice.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Mr. Warrior, congratulations on your decades of service. Thank you for all your work here in Palo Alto, and may your retirement be full of joy and new adventures.
Mayor
I
Klein,
think
this
I see Mr. Warrior wanting to speak, so let's please allow that, actually. Beth, if you could help out.
Mr. Warrior, go ahead and speak. Mr. Warrior, we can't understand you. Mr. Warrior, would you like to try again? Mr. Warrior, go ahead.
This is unfortunate.
Yes, it doesn't seem to be working from his end.
Yeah, Mr. Warrior, sorry, it's not coming through.
Frustrating. Maybe he could come back next week. Do you think, Adrian?
Yeah, I'd be happy to welcome you back, Mr. Warrior, if you want to call into next week's meeting.
Perhaps we could let him do that on the earlier side since he waited all night. I could see his name in the list.
Yep.
Good suggestion.
Okay. Mr. Warrior, I'm sorry the audio is not working.
Oh dear.
But on behalf of the council and community, thank you for your decades of service here. We truly appreciate it, and it's a real honor. All right, let's go back to council. I see a hand from Councilmember Koo.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask, and I'm very glad that Ms. Duller is here. Thank you for all your work on the previous agenda item. But, the state is still going through with a lot of their proposed Senate bills and Assembly bills. And I'm going to ask for an update on some of the bills that we should be watching: SB 902, AB 3173, AB 1279, and AB 725. So these are bills that are going to have impacts on our community in terms of losing local control over zoning and land use. So please, I'd like to see that we're updated on this. And then also an update on Plan Bay Area 2050, because I think that they're starting to go through their methodology as well as their forecast. And there's some big impacts that's coming out our way with their RENA numbers. So also, May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So I want to mention, remind, and celebrate the contributions that Asians and Pacific Islanders have made to America's and California's history, society, and culture. And also to the many Muslims in our community who are observing and celebrating Ramadan, wishing them Ramadan Mubarak. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Vice Mayor Du Bois.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention real quick, I've been consistently going to the California Avenue Farmers Market. I think it's been extremely well run. Crowds are definitely picking up this last Sunday, but the booths are spread out. People seem to be, basically watching social distancing, waiting in line. So it seems to be working actually really well. I'm glad to see that.
Thanks for sharing. Just one quick thing, I may have mentioned this a couple weeks ago. California High-Speed Rail recently published their EIR for the northern segment, which I think is San Jose to Madera or thereabouts. Real big project. It's not clear where the funding is coming from, but they are still chugging ahead with some of the environmental impact work. So please go take a look.
Is chugging the operative word?
Who knows? I don't see any other lights. Want to thank you all for a lot of work tonight. Got a lot done, and next week we will get back to it and try to right this ship as much as we can.
Okay.
Great. So it's 11:11, and this meeting's adjourned. Thank you all so much, and thanks to the staff for all your work on this.
Thank you. Good night.
Ciao.